The Aegean Sea in the 3rd millennium BC witnessed the emergence of Europe's first advanced civilizations, marking a dramatic departure from the simple farming communities that had characterized the Neolithic period. On the island of Crete, a sophisticated maritime culture began developing around 2700 BC that would eventually dominate trade routes across the eastern Mediterranean. This civilization, which archaeologists call Minoan after the legendary king Minos, established the foundation for what would later become recognizably Greek culture. The earliest Minoan settlements appeared during the early Bronze Age, concentrated in fertile valleys and coastal plains across Crete. These communities initially resembled other contemporary Bronze Age societies, with small villages centered around agriculture and basic crafts. However, by 2000 BC a remarkable transformation had occurred. Massive palace complexes began rising at sites like Knossos, Phaistos, Melia and Zakros, each serving as the administrative, religious and economic centre for its surrounding territory. The palace at Knossos, eventually covering over 20,000 square metres, exemplified Minoan architectural sophistication. Its multi-storey buildings contained hundreds of rooms, connected by corridors, staircases and light wells that brought natural illumination deep into the structure. Storage magazines lined with enormous pithoi, ceramic jars taller than a person, held olive oil, wine, grain and other commodities. The famous throne room, with its griffin frescoes and gypsum throne, demonstrated the ceremonial importance of these complexes. Advanced engineering included sophisticated drainage systems, with clay pipes carrying water and waste throughout the buildings. Minoan society developed a complex administrative system to manage their expanding territories and trade networks. Clay tablets inscribed with linear A script, discovered in palace archives across Crete, record what appear to be inventories, land tenure records, and religious offerings. Despite numerous attempts at decipherment, Linear A remains undeciphered, though scholars recognise it as recording a non-Indo-European language distinct from later Greek. The tablets reveal a highly organised bureaucracy tracking everything from livestock counts to textile production quotas. The Minoans developed remarkable artistic traditions that reflected their maritime culture and religious beliefs. Frescoes adorning palace walls depicted dolphins leaping through azure waters, elegant court ladies with elaborate hairstyles and flounced skirts, and athletic young people vaulting over charging bulls. These bull-leaping scenes, found throughout Minoan sites, likely inspired later Greek legends of the Minotaur, the half-man, half-bull creature said to dwell in a labyrinth beneath Knossos. The complexity of the palace layouts themselves may have contributed to these maze-like mythological associations. Religious practices centred around female deities, often depicted holding snakes or flanked by lions, suggesting connections to fertility and nature worship. Mountain peak sanctuaries scattered across Crete's highlands contained votive offerings, including bronze figurines, double axes and ceramic vessels. The famous snake goddess figurines, with their exposed breasts and serpentine companions, embodied the powerful feminine divine principle that permeated Minoan spirituality. Minoan influence extended far beyond Crete through extensive trade networks. Their distinctive pottery appears in archaeological contexts from Egypt's Nile Delta to Sicily's eastern shores. At Tel el-Dabar in Egypt, Minoan-style frescoes decorated palace walls, while Minoan-influenced artefacts reached inland sites across Anatolia and the Levant. This commercial reach brought exotic materials back to Crete. Egyptian gold, Anatolian silver, Baltic amber, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan all flowed through Minoan ports. The civilization's maritime expertise enabled this far-flung commerce. Minoan ships, depicted in frescoes and on seals, featured distinctive curved prows and multiple oars, capable of traversing the often treacherous Mediterranean waters. Harbour installations at sites like Komos on Crete's southern coast reveal sophisticated port facilities designed to accommodate large merchant vessels. Around 1700 BC, a catastrophic event, likely a massive earthquake, destroyed the first palaces across Crete. However, the Minoans rebuilt on an even grander scale, entering what archaeologists term the late Minoan period. The reconstructed palaces displayed even greater architectural sophistication and artistic refinement, suggesting the civilization had reached its cultural zenith. While Minoan civilization flourished on Crete, a different culture was emerging on the Greek mainland. Around 2000 BC, Indo-European speaking peoples began settling in the southern Balkans, bringing with them new technologies, social structures, and languages that would eventually evolve into ancient Greek. These newcomers, whom we call Mycenaeans after their principal site at Mycenae, initially lived in small agricultural communities scattered across the Peloponnese and central Greece. The Mycenaeans developed a markedly different society from their Minoan contemporaries. Where Minoan culture emphasized trade, artistic refinement, and apparent peaceful coexistence, Mycenaean society centered around warrior elites who ruled from heavily fortified citadels. By 1600 BC, wealthy burial goods in shaft graves at Mycenae revealed a stratified society with a powerful aristocratic class. Gold death masks, bronze weapons decorated with intricate inlays, and jewellery of extraordinary craftsmanship demonstrated both the wealth and martial values of Mycenaean elites. The famous gold mask discovered by Heinrich Schliemann, which he dramatically claimed belonged to Agamemnon, actually predates the legendary Trojan War by several centuries. Nevertheless, it exemplifies the sophisticated metalworking techniques and social stratification characteristic of early Mycenaean culture. Warriors were buried with bronze swords featuring elaborate hilts, boar's tusk helmets, and figure-eight shields that appear frequently in later Homeric descriptions of heroic warfare. Mycenaean settlements grew increasingly fortified as the civilization matured. The massive walls at Mycenae, Tiryns, and other sites employed Cyclopean masonry, enormous limestone blocks fitted together without mortar. Later Greeks, unable to imagine how mortals could have moved such massive stones, attributed these constructions to the Cyclops, the one-eyed giants of mythology. The Lion Gate at Mycenae, with its triangular relief sculpture of two lions flanking a column, served both as defensive architecture and symbolic statement of royal power. Palace complexes within these fortifications, while smaller than their Minoan counterparts, served similar administrative functions. The Megaron, a rectangular hall with central hearth and 4 columns supporting the roof, became the architectural signature of Mycenaean royal residences. These structures, with their formal throne rooms and adjacent administrative quarters, established patterns that would influence later Greek architectural traditions. The Mycenaeans adopted and adapted Linear A script from the Minoans, developing their own writing system called Linear B. Unlike its predecessor, Linear B was successfully deciphered by Michael Ventris in 1952, revealing it recorded an early form of Greek language. The tablets, primarily found at Pylos, Knossos, and other palace sites, contain detailed administrative records covering land tenure, taxation, religious offerings, and military organization. These Linear B archives provide unprecedented insight into Bronze Age Greek society. They record a complex feudal system with the one axe at its apex, supported by a hierarchy of officials including the Lawagetas and various local governors. The tablets catalogue everything from chariot inventories to perfumed oil production, revealing a sophisticated palace economy that controlled agricultural production, craft specialization, and trade relationships across the Aegean. Military organization features prominently in Linear B records, reflecting Mycenaean society's warrior ethos. Tablets list bronze smiths producing weapons, leather workers crafting armour, and chariot builders constructing the horse-drawn vehicles that dominated Bronze Age warfare. The famous Pylos chariot tablets detail the assignment of specific vehicles to named individuals, suggesting a professional military class dependent on palace resources. Mycenaean expansion across the Aegean accelerated during the 15th century BC. They established settlements on numerous islands, including Rhodes, Kos, and eventually Crete itself. The presence of Linear B tablets at Knossos indicates Mycenaean control over the former Minoan capital by 1450 BC, though the exact circumstances of this takeover remain debated. Some scholars propose military conquest, while others suggest gradual infiltration through trade relationships and intermarriage. The integration of Minoan and Mycenaean cultural elements created a distinctive Late Bronze Age Aegean civilization. Mycenaean pottery incorporated Minoan decorative motifs, while Minoan artistic techniques influenced Mycenaean fresco painting and metalwork. Religious practices blended traditions, with Linear B tablets recording offerings to deities whose names would later appear in classical Greek mythology, Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, and Athena among them. Trade networks established by the Minoans expanded under Mycenaean control to encompass the entire eastern Mediterranean. Mycenaean pottery appears in archaeological contexts from southern Italy to the Levantine coast, often accompanied by other Greek products including perfumed oils, textiles, and metalwork. Sites like Ugarit in Syria and Hattusa in Anatolia have yielded significant quantities of Mycenaean imports, while Egyptian tomb paintings depict Greek traders presenting gifts to pharaohs. This commercial expansion brought exotic materials and influences back to Greece. Ivory from Syria and Egypt was carved into decorative plaques and figurines found in Mycenaean palaces. Amber from northern Europe reached Greek sites through complex overland trade routes. Most significantly, contact with Near Eastern civilizations exposed the Mycenaeans to advanced technologies, artistic techniques, and possibly literary traditions that would profoundly influence later Greek culture. The wealth generated by this extensive trade supported increasingly elaborate palace cultures across the Greek world. Sites like Pylos in Messenia developed into major administrative centres controlling substantial territories. The palace there, destroyed around 1200 BC but preserved under ash and debris, contained archives of over 1,000 Linear B tablets, providing detailed snapshots of Bronze Age Greek administration, economy, and society. Religious practices documented in Linear B tablets reveal continuities with later Greek traditions, alongside distinctly Bronze Age elements. The tablets record offerings to familiar deities but also mention religious officials and practices that disappeared before the historical period. Poseidon appears as a major deity, sometimes paired with a female consort, while Zeus, though present, seems less prominent than in later Greek religion. The tablets also reference religious festivals, sacred precincts, and elaborate ritual offerings that required substantial palace resources. Mycenaean military capabilities enabled their expansion, but also reflected growing tensions across the eastern Mediterranean during the 13th century BC. Fortification walls were strengthened and extended at major sites, while weapons production increased significantly according to Linear B records. The famous boar's tusk helmet, described in Homer's Iliad, archaeological examples of which have been found in Mycenaean contexts, exemplifies the sophisticated military equipment available to elite warriors. Maritime technology advanced to support both military and commercial activities. Mycenaean ships, larger and more robust than earlier Minoan vessels, could carry substantial cargoes across long distances while also serving military functions. Representations on pottery and frescoes show vessels with reinforced hulls, multiple rows of oars, and distinctive ram prows suitable for naval warfare. The prosperity and expansion of Bronze Age Aegean civilization reached its zenith during the 13th century BC, but signs of instability were already emerging. Destruction levels at various sites suggest increasing warfare, while some settlements were abandoned or reduced in size. Palace archives from this period record emergency measures including the mobilization of additional troops and the reinforcement of coastal defences. Around 1200 BC, catastrophic destruction struck virtually every major Mycenaean centre simultaneously. Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, and numerous other sites show clear evidence of violent destruction, with palace buildings burned and administrative systems collapsed. The Linear B script disappeared entirely, along with the complex administrative machinery it had served. This widespread collapse marked the end of Bronze Age civilization in the Aegean and initiated the period known as the Greek Dark Ages. The causes of this Bronze Age collapse remain hotly debated among scholars. Contemporary Egyptian and Hittite sources describe attacks by groups they called the Sea Peoples, maritime raiders who disrupted trade routes and attacked coastal settlements throughout the eastern Mediterranean. These mysterious peoples, whose ethnic identities remain uncertain, may have included displaced populations from various regions affected by the widespread upheavals of the period. The catastrophic events that destroyed Bronze Age civilization around 1200 BC initiated one of the most dramatic demographic collapses in Mediterranean history. Archaeological surveys across Greece reveal a staggering reduction in settlement numbers, with some regions experiencing population declines of up to 90%. The fertile Argolid, which had supported numerous thriving communities during the Mycenaean period, retained only a handful of small villages scattered across its plains. In Messenia, the area around the destroyed palace of Pylos became virtually uninhabited, with archaeological evidence suggesting that large territories remained empty for generations. This demographic catastrophe extended far beyond simple population reduction. The complex social hierarchies that had characterized Mycenaean society vanished entirely, replaced by small kinship-based groups struggling for survival in an increasingly fragmented landscape. The warrior elites who had dominated Bronze Age politics disappeared, taking with them the sophisticated administrative systems, specialized crafts, and long-distance trade networks that had sustained palace civilization. Without centralized authority to maintain them, the massive fortification walls at sites like Mycenae and Tiryns gradually crumbled, their cyclopean stones becoming quarries for later builders who lacked the organizational capacity to construct on such scales. The loss of literacy represented perhaps the most profound break with the Bronze Age past. Linear B script, which had recorded the complex administrative transactions of palace bureaucracies, vanished completely from the archaeological record after 1200 BC. The scribes who had maintained these archives either perished in the destructions or found their specialized skills irrelevant in the simplified societies that emerged from the collapse. For nearly 4 centuries, Greece would remain entirely pre-literate, with oral tradition becoming the sole means of preserving cultural memory and transmitting knowledge across generations. Material culture reflected this dramatic simplification. The elaborate pottery styles that had characterized late Mycenaean civilization gave way to crude hand-made vessels with minimal decoration. The sophisticated bronze-working techniques that had produced intricate weapons and ornaments were largely forgotten, forcing communities to rely on simpler iron implements as that technology gradually spread westward from Anatolia. Monumental architecture disappeared entirely, with even the largest Dark Age settlements consisting of simple oval or apsidal houses built from fieldstones and mud brick. Trade networks that had once connected the Aegean to Egypt, the Levant and the Western Mediterranean contracted to purely local exchanges. Exotic materials like ivory, gold and precious stones vanished from Greek archaeological contexts, replaced by locally available resources worked with increasingly basic techniques. The cosmopolitan culture that had characterized Bronze Age Aegean civilization fragmented into isolated communities with minimal contact beyond their immediate neighbours. Yet even in these reduced circumstances, certain elements of Bronze Age culture persisted in modified forms. Religious practices continued at some traditional sanctuary sites, though on much smaller scales and with simpler ritual equipment. The cult of Zeus at Olympia maintained continuity through the Dark Ages, as evidenced by votive offerings found in stratified deposits spanning the transition period. Similarly, the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi retained its sacred character, though the elaborate Bronze Age installations gave way to modest shrines tended by local communities. Archaeological evidence from sites like Lefkandi on Euboea demonstrates that some communities managed to maintain higher levels of material culture than their neighbours. Excavations there have revealed a remarkable 10th century BC building measuring over 45 metres in length, containing rich burial goods that suggest contact with Cyprus and the eastern Mediterranean. The principal burial included an iron sword with ivory hilt, gold jewellery and bronze vessels that indicate this community had somehow preserved access to long-distance trade networks even during the depths of the Dark Ages. The gradual recovery that began around 900 BC manifested first in subtle archaeological indicators before becoming clearly visible in the material record. Settlement surveys show a slow but steady increase in site numbers across many regions of Greece, with new communities establishing themselves in previously abandoned territories. The pottery record reveals improving technical skills, with wheel-made vessels gradually replacing hand-built ceramics and decorative schemes becoming more sophisticated. Population growth accelerated during the 9th century BC, driven partly by agricultural innovations and partly by the gradual restoration of security that allowed communities to expand beyond easily defensible locations. The introduction of iron technology, while initially representing a step backward from Bronze Age metallurgical sophistication, ultimately provided access to more abundant raw materials than the copper and tin required for bronze production. Iron ore deposits scattered throughout Greece enabled local communities to produce their own tools and weapons without relying on long-distance trade networks. The revival of maritime activity marked a crucial turning point in Greece's emergence from the Dark Ages. Communities along the Aegean coastline began venturing beyond local waters, initially for fishing and small-scale trading, but gradually extending their range to include longer voyages. Archaeological evidence from the 8th century BC shows renewed contact between Greek settlements and communities in Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Levant, with pottery styles and decorative motifs beginning to reflect these renewed cultural exchanges. The adoption of alphabetic writing from Phoenician traders represents one of the most significant developments of the recovery period. Unlike Linear B, which had been restricted to palace scribes and administrative functions, the new alphabet proved remarkably adaptable to Greek linguistic needs and could be learned by individuals outside specialized bureaucratic contexts. The earliest Greek alphabetic inscriptions, dating to around 750 BC, appear on pottery vessels and personal objects, suggesting that literacy spread initially through informal channels rather than institutional frameworks. This alphabetic revolution had profound implications for cultural transmission and preservation. For the first time since the Bronze Age collapse, Greeks possessed a writing system capable of recording not just administrative data, but also literary, religious, and historical material. The flexibility of alphabetic script made it particularly suitable for recording the complex metrical patterns of oral poetry, enabling the preservation of traditional songs and stories that had previously existed only in the memories of performers. The composition and transmission of the Homeric epics during this period represents the culmination of centuries of oral poetic tradition. The Iliad and Odyssey, while set in a heroic Bronze Age past, actually preserve cultural memories spanning the entire Dark Age period, combining authentic Bronze Age details with later innovations in a complex literary synthesis. Archaeological discoveries have confirmed the accuracy of many Homeric descriptions of Bronze Age material culture, including the boar's tusk helmet found in Mycenaean contexts and the massive silver-studded swords that appear in Linear B inventories. Yet the epics also contain numerous anachronisms that reflect Dark Age and early Archaic period realities. The political structures described in Homer, with their emphasis on warrior assemblies and personal loyalty bonds between leaders and followers, more closely resemble Dark Age social organisation than the complex bureaucratic hierarchies documented in linear B tablets. Similarly, the religious practices depicted in the epics blend Bronze Age elements with innovations that developed during the post-palatial period. The oral poets who shaped these traditions, known as aeidoi or rhapsodes, played crucial roles in preserving and transmitting cultural memory across the Dark Ages. These professional performers memorized vast repertoires of traditional stories, genealogies, and religious lore, adapting their material to suit different audiences while maintaining essential narrative frameworks. The formulaic language characteristic of Homeric poetry, repeated epithets, standard scenes, and conventional phrases served as mnemonic devices that enabled accurate transmission across generations of oral performance. Archaeological evidence suggests that these poetic traditions drew upon authentic historical memories preserved in oral form. The catalogue of ships in the Iliad, for instance, describes political geography that corresponds remarkably closely to Mycenaean period settlement patterns documented through archaeological survey. Many of the sites mentioned in the catalogue were abandoned during the Dark Ages, suggesting that the poetic tradition preserved Bronze Age geographical knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. The religious developments of this period established many of the fundamental characteristics of later Greek religion. The anthropomorphic conception of deities that would dominate classical Greek religious thought emerged during the Dark Ages through the synthesis of Bronze Age divine traditions with newer theological concepts. The Olympian pantheon, while including deities whose names appear in Linear B tablets, acquired its characteristic family relationships and personality traits during the post-palatial period. Major sanctuary sites began developing the architectural and institutional frameworks that would support the great religious festivals of the archaic and classical periods. At Olympia, the earliest temple of Hera dates to around 800 BC, marking the beginning of monumental religious architecture in post-Bronze Age Greece. The building, constructed using local limestone and wooden columns, established architectural principles that would influence temple design for centuries. Its simple rectangular plan with surrounding colonnade created the basic template for the Doric order that would become synonymous with Greek religious architecture. The establishment of regular athletic competitions at Olympia, traditionally dated to 776 BC, reflected broader social and religious developments occurring throughout Greece during this period. These games served multiple functions beyond simple athletic competition, providing opportunities for communities scattered across the Greek world to maintain contact, exchange information, and demonstrate their prosperity and military capabilities. The prize system, which awarded only symbolic olive wreaths rather than material rewards, emphasized honor and prestige over economic incentives, reflecting the aristocratic values that were emerging as dominant social forces. Similar developments occurred at other major sanctuary sites across Greece. Delphi began developing its characteristic oracular practices during the 8th century BC, with the Pythia delivering prophetic pronouncements that guided communities facing difficult decisions about colonization, warfare, and internal governance. The sanctuary's location on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, with its dramatic geological features, including the famous chasm from which intoxicating vapours allegedly emerged, provided an appropriately awesome setting for divine communication. The codification of Olympic mythology during this period created standardized versions of divine genealogies and relationships that had previously varied among different communities and poetic traditions. The theogony attributed to Hesiod, probably composed during the late 8th century BC, systematized these diverse traditions into a coherent cosmological framework that explained the origins of the universe, the succession of divine generations, and the establishment of Zeus's supreme authority. This theological synthesis drew upon Near Eastern creation myths, while adapting them to distinctively Greek cultural concerns. Religious festivals expanded beyond individual sanctuary sites to become regional and eventually pan-Hellenic institutions that reinforced emerging Greek ethnic identity. The Panathenaea at Athens, the Isthmian Games near Corinth, and the Nemean Games in the Argolid joined the Olympic festival as major religious celebrations that attracted participants from across the Greek world. These gatherings served as venues for cultural exchange, political negotiation, and the display of community wealth and artistic achievement. The artistic renaissance that accompanied Greece's emergence from the Dark Ages manifested most clearly in pottery production and decoration. The geometric style that developed during the 9th and 8th centuries BC represented a dramatic departure from the naturalistic traditions of Bronze Age art, emphasizing abstract patterns and stylized representations of human and animal figures. The great geometric amphora discovered in the Kerameikos Cemetery at Athens, standing over 1.5 meters tall and decorated with complex bands of meanders, triangles and processional scenes, exemplifies the sophisticated artistic achievements of this period. The geometric pottery traditions that had spread across the Greek world during the 8th century BC marked more than artistic revival. They signalled the emergence of a revolutionary new form of political organisation that would define Greek civilization for centuries. As communities grew larger and more prosperous, the simple kinship-based structures that had sustained Dark Age settlements proved inadequate for managing increasingly complex societies. The solution that emerged transformed scattered tribal groups into the polis, the city-state system that became the fundamental unit of Greek political life. The earliest poleis developed organically from existing settlements as population growth forced communities to establish formal institutions for governance, defence and resource distribution. Archaeological evidence from sites like Athens, Corinth and Argos reveals rapid urban expansion during the mid-8th century BC, with scattered farmsteads coalescing around fortified central areas that served as administrative and religious focal points. These urban cores, typically situated on defensible heights called the Acropolis, housed the community's primary temple, storage facilities for communal resources, and meeting spaces where citizens could gather for political deliberation. The physical layout of these emerging city-states reflected their fundamental organising principles. Unlike the palace-centred settlements of the Bronze Age, where all authority flowed from a single royal household, the polis distributed power among its citizen body through institutions designed to promote collective decision-making. The agora, an open public square that became the commercial and political heart of every Greek city, provided space for markets, assemblies, and informal social interaction. Surrounding the agora, public buildings housed the various magistrates and councils responsible for different aspects of civic administration. Citizenship in these early poleis carried both privileges and obligations that distinguished it sharply from the subject status that had characterized Bronze Age societies. Citizens possessed the right to participate in political assemblies, hold public office, own land within the polis territory, and receive protection under the community's laws. In return, they accepted responsibility for military service, financial contributions during emergencies, and participation in religious festivals that maintained the community's relationship with its patron deities. This reciprocal relationship between individual and community created unprecedented levels of civic engagement and personal investment in collective welfare. The military implications of polis organisation proved particularly significant for Greek society's development. The traditional Bronze Age emphasis on individual warrior heroes, fighting from horse-drawn chariots with elaborate bronze weapons, gave way to disciplined formations of heavily armed infantry called hoplites. These citizen soldiers provided their own equipment: bronze helmet, breastplate, greaves, circular shield, spear and sword, representing a substantial financial investment that limited hoplite service to men of moderate wealth or better. The hoplite phalanx, with its interlocked shields and coordinated spear thrusts, required extensive training and absolute mutual dependence among its members. This military transformation had profound social consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. The hoplite system created a new middle class of farmers, craftsmen and merchants whose military service gave them legitimate claims to political participation. Unlike the aristocratic warriors of earlier periods, who fought as individuals and depended on personal retainers, hoplites succeeded through collective discipline and shared sacrifice. The egalitarian ethos of the phalanx, where survival depended equally on every man's courage and skill, translated into demands for broader political representation within the polis structure. The emergence of this hoplite class coincided with significant economic changes that provided the material foundation for polis development. Agricultural innovations, including the cultivation of olives and grapes alongside traditional grain crops, created surplus production that could support specialized craftsmen and traders. The olive oil and wine produced in Greek territories proved highly valued in foreign markets, generating wealth that enabled communities to purchase metal ores, luxury goods, and other materials unavailable locally. This agricultural diversification also made Greek communities less vulnerable to harvest failures, since olive trees and grapevines could survive drought conditions that destroyed grain crops. Simultaneously, the revival of maritime trade created new opportunities for accumulating wealth outside traditional agricultural channels. Greek merchants, initially following routes pioneered by Phoenician traders, gradually established their own commercial networks throughout the Mediterranean. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency systems facilitated these exchanges, with cities like Aegina and Corinth developing silver coins that became widely accepted mediums of exchange. The wealth generated by this expanding commerce supported the construction projects, religious festivals, and military equipment that marked successful polis. As these economic and social changes accelerated, Greek communities faced increasing pressure on their limited agricultural territories. The mountainous terrain that characterized most of the Greek peninsula restricted the amount of land suitable for farming, while growing populations required ever larger food supplies. This land shortage, combined with social tensions between established aristocratic families and the emerging hoplite class, created conditions that encouraged communities to seek solutions through overseas expansion. The Great Colonization movement that began around 750 BC represented a coordinated response to these demographic and economic pressures. Unlike the random migrations that had characterized earlier periods, Greek colonization followed systematic patterns designed to establish permanent settlements that would maintain connections with their founding cities. Each colonial expedition received official sanction from its mother city, along with carefully selected leadership, religious sanction from major oracles, and predetermined objectives for territorial acquisition and economic development. The process of establishing a new colony involved elaborate religious and legal procedures that ensured the settlement's legitimacy and maintained its ties to the founding community. Colonists carried sacred fire from their home city's public hearth to kindle the flame in their new settlement's prytaneon, symbolically extending the mother city's divine protection to the overseas territory. The colony's founding hero, typically the expedition's leader, received posthumous honours that paralleled those accorded to the mother city's own legendary founders, creating parallel religious traditions that reinforced the connection between the two communities. Chalcis and Eretria on the island of Euboea pioneered many of these colonization techniques, establishing settlements along the coasts of southern Italy and Sicily that became models for later colonial foundations. The Euboean settlement at Cumae, founded around 740 BC near modern Naples, created the first permanent Greek presence in the western Mediterranean. The colonists selected this site for its excellent natural harbour, fertile agricultural hinterland, and strategic position controlling access to central Italy's metal resources. Within a generation, Cumy had established its own trading networks with indigenous Italian communities and begun founding subsidiary settlements along the surrounding coastline. The success of these early Euboean colonies encouraged other Greek cities to organise their own overseas expeditions. Corinth, strategically positioned on the narrow isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to central Greece, leveraged its location to become one of the most active colonising powers. Around 733 BC, Corinthian colonists established Syracuse on the eastern coast of Sicily, selecting a site that combined an excellent natural harbour with access to the island's fertile interior plains. The settlement's position on the large island of Ortygia, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway, provided natural defences that enabled the colonists to establish secure control over their new territory. Syracuse quickly developed into one of the most prosperous and powerful Greek cities in the western Mediterranean. The colony's agricultural territories, worked by indigenous populations reduced to serf-like status, produced grain surpluses that supported rapid population growth and urban development. Syracusan craftsmen developed distinctive pottery styles and metalworking techniques that combined Greek traditions with local innovations, creating products that found markets throughout the Mediterranean. The city's strategic location made it a natural hub for trade between Greece proper and the western colonies, generating additional wealth through commercial activities. Other Greek cities followed Corinth's example with their own Sicilian foundations. Megara established Megara Hyblaea on Sicily's eastern coast, while various Rhodian and Cretan communities founded Gela on the island's southern shore. These colonies often came into conflict with each other as they expanded their territories and competed for control over indigenous populations and resources. The resulting warfare, conducted with hoplite tactics adapted to local conditions, created a militaristic culture in the western Greek colonies that distinguished them from their generally more peaceful mother cities. The colonization movement extended beyond Sicily to encompass the entire Mediterranean basin. Greek settlements appeared along the coast of southern Italy, earning the region the name Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. Cities like Sybaris, Croton and Tarentum established control over extensive territories and accumulated enormous wealth through agricultural production and trade. Sybaris, founded by Achaean colonists around 720 BC, became legendary for its prosperity and luxury, controlling territory that extended across the Italian peninsula from the Ionian to the Tyrrhenian Sea. The northern shores of the Black Sea attracted Greek colonists seeking access to the grain, fish, and raw materials produced by the Scythian populations of the region. Miletus, the great Ionian commercial city, established dozens of colonies along the Black Sea coastline, including major settlements at Sinope, Trapezus, and Tanais. These foundations created a network of Greek trading posts that channeled Scythian wheat, honey, wax, furs, and slaves to markets throughout the Greek world. The grain imports from these Black Sea colonies became essential for supporting the growing populations of cities like Athens, which lacked sufficient agricultural territory to feed their citizens. Greek expansion also reached the western Mediterranean, where colonists established settlements along the coasts of modern France and Spain. The Phocian foundation of Massalia around 600 BC created the first permanent Greek presence in the western Mediterranean beyond the Italian peninsula. The colonists selected this site at the mouth of the Rhone River for its excellent natural harbour and access to the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean with the interior regions of Gaul. Massalia's merchants established trading relationships with Celtic populations throughout southern France, exchanging Greek wine, pottery and manufactured goods for raw materials including metals, amber and agricultural products. The wealth and cultural sophistication that these colonial foundations brought to the Greek world accelerated political developments within the mother cities. The profits from colonial trade and the military experience gained through overseas expansion strengthened the hoplite class while creating new opportunities for individual advancement outside traditional aristocratic channels. successful merchants and craftsmen could now accumulate wealth that rivaled that of established noble families, while military service and colonial expeditions provided paths to political prominence for ambitious young men. These social changes created increasing tensions within the traditional political structures of the emerging polis. Aristocratic families who had dominated Dark Age communities found their authority challenged by newly wealthy merchants and the organised political demands of the hoplite class. The resulting conflicts took various forms, from peaceful constitutional reforms to violent civil wars that transformed the political landscape of the Greek world. Athens provides the clearest example of how these tensions played out in constitutional terms. During the 7th century BC, the city experienced severe social conflicts between the established aristocratic families, known as the Eupatridae, and the broader citizen body. The traditional system of governance, which concentrated power in the hands of aristocratic magistrates called archons, proved inadequate for managing the complex disputes that arose as Athenian society became more stratified and economically diverse. The crisis reached its peak around 630 BC when a young aristocrat named Cylon attempted to establish himself as tyrant with support from his father-in-law, the tyrant of Megara. The coup attempt failed when the Athenian people refused to support Cylon, but the violent suppression of his followers by the Archon Megacles created a religious pollution that haunted Athenian politics for generations. The incident demonstrated both the fragility of traditional aristocratic authority and the potential for ambitious individuals to exploit social tensions for personal advancement. In response to this crisis, the Athenians commissioned Draco to codify their laws around 621 BC. This represented the first attempt by a Greek community to establish written legal standards that would apply equally to all citizens, regardless of their social status. Draco's laws, inscribed on wooden tablets and displayed in public spaces, covered a wide range of civil and criminal matters, from property disputes to homicide cases. The code's severity, which prescribed death for most offences, gave rise to the term draconian for excessively harsh legal measures. Despite their harshness, Draco's laws represented a crucial step toward establishing the rule of law as a fundamental principle of polis governance. By making legal procedures public and standardized, the code limited the arbitrary power that aristocratic magistrates had previously exercised over legal disputes. Citizens could now predict the consequences of their actions and challenge judicial decisions that appeared to violate established procedures. The written law also created precedents that could guide future legal decisions, gradually building a body of jurisprudence that reflected community values rather than individual preferences. However, Draco's legal reforms failed to address the underlying economic issues that created social tension within Athenian society. Many small farmers had fallen into debt to wealthy landowners, often being forced to mortgage their land or even their personal freedom to secure loans. When harvest failed or market conditions deteriorated, these debtors faced the loss of their property and reduction to slavery. The resulting concentration of land ownership in the hands of a few wealthy families threatened to create a permanent class of landless poor who would be excluded from the political and military participation that defined citizenship. The appointment of Solon as Archon around 594 BC marked a more comprehensive attempt to resolve these structural problems through constitutional reform. Solon, himself a member of the aristocratic class but known for his moderate views and poetic wisdom, received extraordinary powers to restructure Athenian society and government. His reforms, known collectively as the Sysaktheia or shaking off of burdens, addressed both immediate economic grievances and long-term political organisation. Solon's economic reforms began with the cancellation of all debts secured by land or personal freedom, immediately freeing Athenian citizens who had been reduced to slavery through economic hardship. He also prohibited future loans that used the borrower's person as collateral, preventing the re-emergence of debt slavery. To address the underlying causes of the debt crisis, Solon reformed the system of weights and measures, potentially devaluing existing debts while encouraging trade through standardization. He also promoted economic diversification by encouraging the cultivation of olives and the development of craft industries that could compete in overseas markets. The political aspects of Solon's reforms proved even more significant for the long-term development of Athenian democracy. He replaced the traditional system of aristocratic privilege with a new classification based on wealth, dividing Athenian citizens into 4 classes according to their annual agricultural production. The wealthier citizens, producing 500 measures of grain or equivalent value in other products, formed the Pentaikosioimedimnoi class and remained eligible for the highest offices. The Hippies class, producing 300 measures and capable of maintaining a horse for military service, could hold lower magistracies. The Zeugitai, producing 200 measures and serving as hoplites, gained access to minor offices and full participation in the citizen assembly. Even the Thetes, the poorer citizens who served as light infantry or rowers, received the right to participate in the assembly and serve on juries. This system, while still favouring the wealthy, represented a dramatic departure from purely aristocratic governance by making political participation dependent on economic contribution rather than birth. Successful merchants and craftsmen could now advance to the highest levels of political authority if they accumulated sufficient wealth, while even poor citizens retained meaningful roles in the political process. The creation of the Heliaia, a popular court where large juries of citizens decided major legal cases, further democratized the judicial system by removing the exclusive authority of aristocratic magistrates. While Athens experimented with constitutional reforms that gradually expanded political participation, a radically different solution to the challenges of polis development emerged in the southern Peloponnese. Sparta, situated in the fertile Eurotas valley of Laconia, created a social and political system so distinctive that it would fascinate and horrify other Greeks for centuries. Unlike the commercial city-states that embraced trade and cultural exchange, Sparta deliberately isolated itself from outside influences to maintain a militaristic society designed around a single overriding purpose: the control and suppression of a massive enslaved population that outnumbered its citizen masters by perhaps 7-1. The origins of this extraordinary system lay in Sparta's early expansion during the 8th century BC, when the Spartans embarked on a series of conquests that would fundamentally shape their society's character. Around 740 BC, facing the same population pressures that drove other Greek communities toward overseas colonization, the Spartans chose instead to expand into neighbouring territories within the Peloponnese itself. Their first major target was Messenia, the fertile region west of Mount Taygetus that contained some of the richest agricultural land in southern Greece. The First Messenian War, lasting approximately 20 years, resulted in the complete subjugation of the Messenian population. Unlike typical Greek warfare of the period, which aimed at limited territorial gains or tribute payments, the Spartan conquest involved the systematic enslavement of the entire defeated population. The Messenians became helots, a term derived from the Greek word meaning captives, bound to work the land for their Spartan masters while retaining no political rights or personal freedom. This massive influx of enslaved agricultural workers freed Spartan citizens from the necessity of farming their own land, enabling them to devote their entire lives to military training and political affairs. The scale of this helot population created an unprecedented security challenge that would dominate Spartan thinking for centuries. Archaeological surveys suggest that the combined helot populations of Laconia and Messenia may have reached 200,000 individuals, while the Spartan citizen body probably never exceeded 10,000 adult males even at its peak. This demographic imbalance meant that Spartans lived in constant fear of helot rebellion. requiring the development of institutions and practices designed to maintain control through systematic intimidation and surveillance. The Spartan response to this challenge involved the creation of a social system that subordinated every aspect of individual life to collective security needs. The traditional Greek emphasis on personal achievement and individual excellence gave way to rigid conformity and group discipline. Private wealth accumulation, which drove political development in other poleis, was actively discouraged through regulations that limited luxury consumption and prohibited the use of gold or silver currency. Instead, Spartans used unwieldy iron bars as their medium of exchange, making commercial transactions so cumbersome that trade with other communities became virtually impossible. This economic isolation served multiple purposes within the Spartan system. By preventing the accumulation of individual wealth, it reduced potential sources of political conflict among citizens, while ensuring that all Spartans remained equally dependent on the labour of their helot agricultural workers. The absence of commercial activity also eliminated contact with foreign merchants, who might introduce destabilising ideas or luxury goods that could undermine the austere lifestyle that Spartan ideology demanded. Most importantly, economic autarky freed Spartan citizens from any need to engage in productive labour, allowing them to concentrate entirely on military training and political participation. The institutional framework that emerged to manage this system centred around a unique form of dual monarchy that balanced royal authority against collective citizen control. Two kings from separate hereditary dynasties, the Aegiads and Eurypontids, shared executive power while serving as high priests and military commanders. This arrangement prevented the concentration of authority in a single individual while ensuring continuity of leadership through hereditary succession. The kings commanded Spartan armies in the field and performed the religious ceremonies that maintained the community's relationship with its patron deities, but their domestic authority remained limited by the oversight of elected magistrates and citizen assemblies. The most powerful of these magistrates were the 5 ephors, elected annually by the citizen assembly to serve as guardians of Spartan law and tradition. The ephors possessed extraordinary authority to investigate and punish any citizen behaviour that threatened the established order, including the power to arrest and try even the kings themselves. They controlled foreign policy, supervised the education system, and managed the complex regulations governing helot treatment. Each month, the ephors formally declared war on the helot population, providing legal justification for the systematic violence that maintained Spartan control over their enslaved workforce. The citizen assembly, called the Apella, included all Spartan males over 30 who had completed their military training and continued to participate in the communal dining system that reinforced social solidarity. Unlike Athenian democratic assemblies where citizens engaged in open debate before voting, the Spartan Apella operated through acclamation, with the loudest shouts determining the outcome of proposed measures. This system discouraged individual oratory and political manoeuvring, while emphasising collective unity and traditional consensus. The Gerousia, a council of 28 men over 60 plus the 2 kings, prepared business for the assembly and served as the highest court for serious criminal cases. Members of the Gerousia held their positions for life after election by the assembly, creating a conservative body that resisted rapid changes to established practices. The Gerontes, as these councillors were called, represented the accumulated wisdom and experience of the Spartan community, while serving as guardians of ancestral customs against innovation or foreign influence. This political system operated within a broader social structure that divided the population into 3 distinct classes, with rigidly defined roles and relationships. At the apex stood the Spartiates, full citizens who had completed the agoge training system and maintained their status through continued participation in military service and communal dining. Below them were the Perioeci, literally dwellers around, who lived in autonomous communities throughout Laconian and Messenian territory while serving Sparta in military and economic capacities. The Perioeci enjoyed personal freedom and could accumulate private wealth through trade and craftsmanship, but they possessed no political rights within the Spartan system and remained subject to Spartan foreign policy decisions. The Helots formed the foundation of this social pyramid, providing the agricultural labour that supported both Spartiates and Perioeci, while remaining in a state of permanent subjugation. Unlike chattel slaves in other Greek communities, who were individually owned and could potentially earn or purchase their freedom, Helots belonged collectively to the Spartan state and remained bound to specific plots of land that they worked for their assigned Spartiate masters. They retained family relationships and some personal property, but they could be killed by any Spartan citizen without legal consequences and faced constant surveillance designed to prevent organised resistance. The maintenance of this system required the development of educational and social institutions, unlike anything found elsewhere in the Greek world. The agoge, Sparta's mandatory training program for male citizens, began at age 7 when boys were removed from their families and organised into groups under the supervision of older youths and adult instructors. This educational system aimed not at intellectual development or artistic achievement, but at creating warriors capable of absolute obedience, physical endurance, and ruthless efficiency in combat. The physical environment of agoge training deliberately emphasized hardship and deprivation to toughen boys for adult military service. Participants received minimal food, requiring them to supplement their rations through theft, which was encouraged as long as they avoided detection. Those caught stealing faced severe punishment, not for the theft itself, but for the incompetence of being discovered. Clothing remained minimal regardless of weather conditions, with boys wearing simple tunics year-round and going barefoot even in winter. Sleeping accommodations consisted of reed mats in unheated dormitories, forcing participants to adapt to discomfort that would prepare them for campaign conditions. Combat training began with wrestling, boxing, and other individual fighting skills, before progressing to coordinated group exercises that emphasized unit cohesion and tactical discipline. Boys learned to fight in the close-order phalanx formation that would dominate their adult military careers, practicing the precise movements and mutual dependence that made this tactical system so effective. Weapons training included not only the standard hoplite equipment of spear, sword, and shield, but also specialized skills like night fighting and guerrilla warfare techniques that would prove useful in suppressing Helot rebellions. The psychological aspects of agoge training proved equally important in shaping Spartan character and values. Boys learned absolute obedience to authority through harsh punishment for any sign of disobedience or individual initiative. They were encouraged to inform on each other's violations of regulations, creating a surveillance system that would continue into adult life. Emotional expression, particularly any display of fear or pain, was ruthlessly suppressed through ridicule and punishment. The famous Spartan laconic speech pattern, characterized by brevity and understatement, developed from this emphasis on emotional control and disdain for elaborate rhetoric. At age 20, successful participants in the agoge became eligible for selection into one of the elite military units that formed the core of Spartan fighting strength. The most prestigious of these was the Royal Bodyguard, composed of 300 men chosen for their exceptional skill and absolute loyalty. These hippairs, despite their name meaning horsemen, fought on foot as the elite infantry formation that led Spartan armies into battle. Selection for this unit represented the pinnacle of military achievement and virtually guaranteed future political prominence within Spartan society. Full citizenship required additional qualifications beyond successful completion of military training. Candidates needed election to one of the Sycetia, the communal dining groups that form the basic units of Spartan social organization. These mess groups, typically consisting of 15 men who had served together in military campaigns, controlled admission through unanimous consent of existing members. The system ensured that only individuals who had demonstrated absolute reliability and conformity to Spartan values could achieve full citizenship status. The Syssitia served multiple functions within Spartan society beyond simple communal dining. Members contributed fixed amounts of food from their Helot-worked estates, creating economic bonds that reinforce social solidarity. The daily meals provided opportunities for older citizens to instruct younger ones in Spartan values and traditions, while maintaining the surveillance system that pervaded all aspects of life. Military planning and political discussions took place within these groups, making them informal centres of power that supplemented the formal governmental institutions. Women occupied a unique position within this militaristic society that distinguished Sparta sharply from other Greek communities. While Spartan women lacked formal political rights, they enjoyed freedoms and responsibilities that would have shocked citizens of Athens or Corinth. The absence of men during frequent military campaigns placed women in charge of managing agricultural estates and supervising Helot labour. This economic authority translated into significant influence over family decisions and community affairs, despite their exclusion from formal political participation. Spartan girls received physical education that paralleled male training in its emphasis on strength, endurance, and competitive excellence. They participated in athletic competitions, including running, wrestling, and javelin throwing, often in the presence of young men who would eventually become their husbands. This practice, which other Greeks considered scandalous, aimed at producing mothers capable of bearing healthy warrior sons, while maintaining the physical fitness necessary for managing large agricultural estates. The marriage customs that developed within this system reflected Sparta's overriding concern with producing and training future warriors. Men typically married around age 30, after completing their military education and gaining admission to a session, while women married in their late teens when they had reached physical maturity. The marriage ceremony involved a ritualized abduction in which the groom captured his bride and briefly lived with her in secret, before returning to his communal barracks. This practice symbolized the subordination of individual romantic preferences to collective military needs, while maintaining the social bonds that held the warrior community together. Married Spartan men continued living in communal barracks until age 30, visiting their wives primarily for reproductive purposes rather than companionship or emotional intimacy. This arrangement reinforced the primacy of military relationships over family bonds while ensuring that children received collective, rather than purely parental upbringing. Women managed households and supervised child-rearing with minimal male involvement, creating a parallel social structure that operated independently of the male military hierarchy. The economic foundation that supported this elaborate social system depended entirely on Helot agricultural production, supplemented by Periesi manufacturing and trade. The fertile valleys of Laconia and Messenia produced grain, olives, and wine sufficient not only to feed the entire Spartan population, but also to generate surpluses that could support the community during military campaigns. Helot families worked assigned plots under Spartan supervision, delivering fixed portions of their harvest to their citizen masters while retaining enough for their own subsistence. This agricultural system proved remarkably stable and productive, enabling Sparta to maintain its large military establishment without engaging in the commercial activities that occupied other Greek communities. The absence of monetary exchange and luxury consumption meant that virtually all economic output could be directed towards military purposes, creating a level of martial specialization unmatched anywhere else in the ancient world. Perioeci communities provided the manufactured goods that Spartans required, including weapons, pottery, and textiles, while their military service supplemented citizen forces during major campaigns. The isolation that this economic system required became increasingly difficult to maintain as other Greek communities developed more sophisticated commercial networks and cultural institutions. Spartan rejection of artistic achievement, intellectual inquiry, and technological innovation left them increasingly behind developments that transformed the broader Greek world during the 6th and 5th centuries BC. While Athens produced philosophers, dramatists, and architects whose works influenced Mediterranean civilization for centuries, Sparta contributed little to Greek cultural development beyond military techniques and political theory. Yet even as Sparta perfected its militaristic society in deliberate isolation from external influences, Athens embarked on a radically different path that would transform not only its own political structure, but the entire concept of governance throughout the Mediterranean world. The constitutional reforms initiated by Solon had addressed immediate economic grievances while establishing the principle that political participation should depend on contribution rather than birth, but they failed to resolve the underlying tensions between traditional aristocratic authority and the growing political consciousness of the broader citizen body. The decades following Solon's archonship witnessed increasing polarization between competing factions that threatened to tear Athenian society apart through civil warfare. The crisis deepened during the 560 SBC when Pisistratos, a charismatic aristocrat with military experience from successful campaigns against Megara, exploited these factional divisions to establish himself as tyrant of Athens. Unlike the negative connotations that the term tyrant would later acquire, Greek tyranny in this period represented a specific form of unconstitutional rule by individuals who seized power through popular support rather than hereditary succession or legal appointment. Pisistratos appealed directly to the rural poor and urban craftsmen who felt excluded from the political arrangements that favoured established aristocratic families, promising land redistribution and public works projects that would provide employment and economic opportunity. The Pisistratid tyranny, which lasted with brief interruptions until 510 BC, demonstrated both the potential benefits and inherent dangers of personal rule within the polis system. Pisistratos and his sons Hippias and Hipparchos transformed Athens from a relatively minor agricultural community into a major cultural and economic centre that rivaled Corinth and the wealthy cities of Ionia. They commissioned elaborate public building projects, including new temples and fountain houses that provided clean water throughout the city. The Great Panathenea, Athens' premier religious festival, expanded under their patronage to include dramatic performances, athletic competitions, and artistic displays that attracted visitors from across the Greek world. The tyrants also promoted economic development through policies that supported small farmers and encouraged craft production for export markets. They established or expanded festivals honouring Dionysus that featured dramatic competitions, laying the groundwork for Athens' later preeminence in theatrical arts. The famous black figure pottery produced by Athenian workshops during this period achieved wide distribution throughout the Mediterranean, competing successfully with Corinthian products that had previously dominated luxury ceramic markets. These economic policies created prosperity that extended beyond the traditional aristocratic elite to include substantial portions of the citizen population. However, tyrannical rule also demonstrated the fundamental incompatibility between personal authority and the collective decision-making that defined polis citizenship. As the initial enthusiasm for Pisistratid reforms faded, their rule became increasingly dependent on foreign support and domestic surveillance. Hippias, who assumed power after his father's death in 527 BC, grew progressively more suspicious and repressive, particularly after his brother Hipparchos was assassinated in 514 BC by Harmodios and Aristogeiton in a personal dispute that later mythology transformed into heroic resistance to tyranny. The expulsion of Hippias in 510 BC, accomplished through Spartan military intervention requested by exiled Athenian aristocrats, created a power vacuum that different factions attempted to fill through competing constitutional proposals. Isagoras, representing traditional aristocratic interests, sought to restore the pre-tyrannical system that had concentrated authority in the hands of established families. His rival Cleisthenes, despite his own aristocratic background as a member of the prominent Alcmaeonid family, proposed instead a radical restructuring of Athenian political organisation that would permanently break the power of traditional kinship groups while extending meaningful political participation to the entire citizen body. The constitutional revolution that Cleisthenes implemented around 508 BC created the institutional foundations of Athenian democracy, while establishing principles of political organisation that would influence constitutional development throughout the ancient world. His reforms began with a complete reorganisation of the citizen body that replaced traditional tribal divisions based on kinship with new artificial tribes that mixed citizens from different geographical areas and social backgrounds. The 4 ancient tribes that had dominated Athenian politics since the Dark Ages gave way to 10 new tribes, each containing citizens from the city centre, the coastal regions, and the inland agricultural areas. This tribal reorganisation, known as the deme system, created 139 local political units called dems that served as the basic building blocks of Athenian political participation. Every citizen belonged to a deme based on his place of residence, and deme membership became hereditary regardless of subsequent changes in domicile. The dems functioned as local governments with their own assemblies, magistrates, and religious festivals, while also serving as the mechanism through which citizens participated in citywide political institutions. Deme assemblies elected representatives to higher offices, maintained local military units, and managed community property and religious obligations. The principle of isonomia, political equality, that underlay these reforms represented a fundamental departure from previous Greek political thought, which had generally accepted hierarchy and differential privilege as natural features of social organisation. Cleisthenes' system ensured that every citizen, regardless of wealth or family background, possessed identical political rights and opportunities for participation in governmental decisions. The random selection of many officials through lot rather than election prevented the emergence of professional political classes while ensuring that ordinary citizens regularly held administrative responsibilities. The Council of 500, perhaps the most innovative of Cleisthenes' institutional creations, exemplified these democratic principles through its composition and procedures. Each of the 10 tribes selected 50 representatives annually through lot from among citizens over 30 years of age, creating a body that genuinely reflected the social and economic diversity of the Athenian population. The council prepared business for the citizen assembly, supervised the execution of assembly decisions, and managed the routine administrative functions that kept the city operating effectively. The council's organisation into 10 prytanes, with each tribal contingent serving as the executive committee for 1/10 of the year, distributed administrative responsibilities while preventing any single group from dominating governmental processes. During their prytany, the 50 tribal representatives lived and ate together in the tholos, a circular building in the agora that served as the seat of government. This arrangement ensured that responsible officials were always available to handle emergencies while creating intensive shared experiences that built solidarity across social and regional divisions. The institution of ostracism, implemented as a safeguard against the return of tyranny, demonstrated the sophisticated political thinking that characterized Cleisthenes' constitutional design. Each year the citizen assembly could vote to exile any individual for 10 years without trial or confiscation of property, simply by writing his name on a pottery shard called an ostrakon. This procedure required a minimum of 6,000 votes to take effect, ensuring that ostracism reflected genuine popular concern rather than factional manipulation. The temporary nature of the exile and the absence of other penalties meant that ostracized individuals could return to full citizenship after their term expired, preventing the permanent elimination of political opponents that had characterized earlier factional conflicts. These democratic innovations emerged from specifically Athenian historical circumstances, but they addressed political problems that affected Greek communities throughout the Mediterranean world. The growth of hoplite classes, the expansion of commercial activity, and the cultural contacts created by colonization had undermined traditional aristocratic authority everywhere, creating demands for broader political participation that existing institutions could not accommodate. Cleisthenes' solution provided a model for constitutional development that influenced political experimentation throughout the Greek world, though few communities adopted democratic institutions as extensively as Athens. The Persian Wars that began in the 490 SBC provided the crucial test that determined whether these democratic institutions could survive external military pressure while maintaining internal cohesion. The Ionian Revolt of 499-494 BZ had demonstrated Persian willingness to intervene directly in Greek affairs to suppress political arrangements that threatened imperial stability. When Athens provided limited naval support to the Ionian rebels, King Darius IV of Persia decided that Athenian democracy represented a dangerous example that required elimination through military conquest. The Persian expedition of 490 BC, commanded by Artaphernes and Datis, aimed at the complete subjugation of Athens and the restoration of Hippias as a client tyrant under Persian oversight. The force that landed at Marathon included perhaps 25,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, supported by a fleet of 600 ships that could provide logistical support and threaten Athenian coastal positions. The Persians selected the Marathon plain for their landing because its flat terrain favoured their cavalry, while its distance from Athens prevented immediate Athenian response to the invasion. The Athenian response to this crisis demonstrated both the military effectiveness and political resilience that democratic institutions had created. The Citizen Assembly voted to mobilise the entire hoplite force of approximately 9,000 men under the command of 10 elected generals, including Miltiades, who possessed crucial knowledge of Persian military techniques from his earlier service in the Chersonese. The decision to march immediately to Marathon, despite the numerical disadvantage and the absence of Spartan support, reflected the confidence that democratic participation had instilled in the Athenian citizen body. The battle that occurred on the Marathon plain on September 12th, 490 BC became one of the most celebrated victories in Greek military history, not only for its tactical brilliance, but for its demonstration that free citizens could defeat the professional armies of despotic empires. Miltiades deployed his forces in an unusually thin line that stretched across the entire width of the plain, preventing Persian cavalry from outflanking the Greek position. He deliberately weakened his centre while strengthening the wings, creating a formation designed to envelop the Persian infantry once battle was joined. The Athenian charge across the mile-wide plain, conducted at full speed to minimise exposure to Persian archery, caught the enemy forces unprepared for the ferocity and coordination of the assault. The Persian centre initially pushed back the weakened Greek middle, but the reinforced Athenian wings broke through their opponents and wheeled inward to attack the Persian rear. The resulting encirclement led to a complete Persian collapse, with approximately 6,400 enemy casualties compared to only 192 Athenian dead. The Persian fleet withdrew immediately, abandoning any attempt to continue the campaign against Athens. The psychological impact of Marathon extended far beyond its immediate military consequences, transforming Athenian self-perception while demonstrating to the entire Greek world that Persian power was not invincible. The victory validated democratic institutions by proving that citizen soldiers motivated by defense of their political freedom could defeat professional armies fighting for imperial conquest. The 192 Athenian dead, buried in a collective grave on the battlefield, became heroic symbols of democratic sacrifice that inspired subsequent generations of citizens to defend their constitutional system against external threats. The decade following Marathon witnessed unprecedented Athenian confidence that manifested in ambitious public projects and aggressive foreign policy initiatives. The discovery of rich silver deposits at Laurion in southeastern Attica provided the financial resources necessary for major military and architectural undertakings. Rather than distributing this windfall among the citizens, as traditional practice would have suggested, the Athenians accepted the proposal of Themistocles to invest the silver revenues in naval construction that would transform Athens into the dominant maritime power in the Aegean Sea. The construction of 200 triremes between 483 and 480 BC represented the largest naval building program in Greek history, creating a fleet that exceeded the combined naval forces of most other Greek cities. These vessels, powered by 170 rowers arranged in 3 tiers and equipped with bronze rams for attacking enemy ships, required extensive training and coordination to operate effectively. The Athenian decision to man these ships primarily with citizens from the Thetes class, who lacked the wealth necessary for hoplite service, further democratized military participation while creating new sources of political influence within the constitutional system. The Persian invasion of 480 BC under Xerxes first tested these naval preparations while presenting the Greek world with its greatest existential crisis since the Bronze Age collapse. The enormous Persian force, which ancient sources estimated at over 1 million men, though modern scholars suggest perhaps 200,000, represented the full military resources of the largest empire in world history. The construction of boat bridges across the Hellespont and the excavation of a canal through the Athos Peninsula demonstrated Persian engineering capabilities while emphasizing the unprecedented scale of their commitment to Greek conquest. The Greek response required unprecedented cooperation among communities that had traditionally viewed each other as rivals or enemies. The Hellenic League, organized around Spartan leadership but including Athens as a co-equal partner, represented the first successful attempt at pan-Greek political coordination since the legendary Trojan War. The League's decision to defend the narrow pass at Thermopylae while simultaneously positioning the combined Greek fleet at Artemision demonstrated sophisticated strategic planning that maximized Greek advantages while minimizing Persian numerical superiority. The heroic sacrifice of Leonidas and his 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, along with 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans who chose to remain with them, became legendary throughout the ancient world as an example of free men's willingness to die rather than submit to despotic rule. The 3-day battle demonstrated both the tactical superiority of Greek heavy infantry and the limitations of courage when facing overwhelming numerical odds. Leonidas's reported response to Persian demands for surrender, "Come and take them," when asked to lay down Greek weapons, exemplified the defiant spirit that would characterize Greek resistance throughout the war. The Persian breakthrough at Thermopylae forced the evacuation of Athens and created the crisis that would define Athenian democracy for generations. Themistocles convinced the citizen assembly to abandon the city entirely, trusting their survival to the wooden walls that the Delphic oracle had cryptically promised would save them. The evacuation of the entire Athenian population to the island of Salamis, while Persian forces occupied and burned Athens, represented an act of collective faith in democratic decision-making that few other political systems could have sustained. The naval battle at Salamis on September 23, 480 BC, vindicated this desperate strategy while dealing Persian naval power a blow from which it never recovered. Themistocles lured the Persian fleet into the narrow straits between Salamis and the mainland, where their numerical advantage became a liability as ships collided with each other in the confined waters. The Greek triremes, manned by experienced crews fighting for their homeland survival, systematically destroyed Persian vessels that could not maneuver effectively in the restricted space. Xerxes, watching the battle from a throne erected on the mainland shore, witnessed the destruction of perhaps 300 Persian ships while Greek losses remained minimal. The psychological impact of this defeat, occurring within sight of the Persian king himself, shattered the aura of invincibility that had sustained Persian expansion for decades. The withdrawal of Xerxes and a substantial portion of his army immediately after Salamis left his general Mardonios with insufficient forces to maintain control over occupied Greek territory. The final Persian defeat at Plataea in 479 BC, achieved through the combined efforts of the largest Greek army ever assembled, eliminated Persian power from European soil while establishing Athens and Sparta as the dominant forces in Greek politics. The battle demonstrated the effectiveness of Greek military cooperation while revealing the tensions that would eventually tear the Hellenic League apart. Spartan hoplites under Pausanias delivered the decisive assault that killed Mardonios and scattered his forces, but Athenian contingents played crucial roles in the victory that gave both cities legitimate claims to leadership of future Greek resistance to Persian power. The aftermath of the Persian Wars created conditions that enabled Athens to transform from a regional power into the head of a maritime empire that would dominate the Aegean for over half a century. The formation of the Delian League in 478 BC, ostensibly organised to continue the war against Persia through coordinated naval operations, provided the institutional framework through which Athens gradually converted allied cities into tribute-paying subjects. The League's treasury, initially housed on the sacred island of Delos to emphasise its pan-Hellenic character, contained contributions from nearly 200 member cities that collectively provided Athens with resources exceeding those of any previous Greek state. The transformation of this defensive alliance into an instrument of Athenian imperialism occurred gradually through a series of precedents that established Athenian authority over League affairs. When Naxos attempted to withdraw from the League around 470 BC, Athens used military force to compel continued participation, while converting the island from an independent ally into a tribute-paying subject. Similar interventions against Thasos and other cities established the principle that League membership was permanent, and that Athens possessed ultimate authority over member cities' domestic and foreign policies. The transfer of the League treasury from Delos to Athens in 454 BC marked the formal acknowledgement of Athenian hegemony, while providing the financial resources that would support the greatest cultural flowering in Greek history. The annual tribute of approximately 400 talents of silver, supplemented by revenues from Athenian-controlled mines and commercial activities, enabled public works projects and cultural patronage on a scale that dwarfed previous Greek achievements. The Periclean building program that began in the 440 SBC transformed Athens into a showcase of architectural and artistic excellence that proclaimed Athenian cultural supremacy throughout the Mediterranean world. The construction of the Parthenon, begun in 447 BC under the supervision of the architects Iktinos and Callicrates, represented the culmination of Greek architectural achievement while serving as a powerful symbol of Athenian imperial power. The temple's Pentelic marble construction, with its subtle mathematical proportions and sophisticated optical corrections, created visual effects that made the building appear perfectly straight and symmetrical from every angle. The elaborate sculptural program, designed by Phidias and executed by teams of master craftsmen, depicted the mythological conflicts between civilization and barbarism that Athenians interpreted as allegories for their own struggle against Persian despotism. The massive chryselephantine statue of Athena Parthenos that dominated the temple's interior, standing nearly 40 feet tall and incorporating over 2,500 pounds of gold, demonstrated both Athenian wealth and religious devotion. The goddess's elaborate costume and attributes, including a shield decorated with scenes from the Amazonomachy and a Nike figure in her extended hand, proclaimed Athens' military victories while emphasizing the divine protection that had enabled their success. The statue's removable gold plating served as a strategic reserve that could be melted down during emergencies, combining religious symbolism with practical financial planning. The magnificent cultural achievements that had transformed Athens into the intellectual and artistic centre of the Greek world during the mid-5th century BC rested upon an increasingly unstable foundation of imperial domination that generated mounting resentment throughout the Aegean. The Delian League's evolution from a defensive alliance into an Athenian empire had created a system of tribute extraction and political control that many Greeks viewed as inconsistent with the fundamental polis principle of autonomy. By 450 BC, Athens controlled approximately 150 subject cities whose annual tribute payments of 460 talents supported not only the Athenian navy, but also the ambitious building programs and cultural patronage that made Athens the envy of the Greek world. This imperial system inevitably brought Athens into conflict with Sparta, whose own alliance network in the Peloponnese represented a fundamentally different approach to interstate relations. The Peloponnesian League, unlike Athens's maritime empire, preserved the formal independence of member cities while requiring their participation in Spartan-led military campaigns. Spartan hegemony rested on military supremacy rather than tribute extraction, allowing allied cities to maintain their traditional institutions and economic systems. These contrasting models of interstate organization reflected deeper ideological differences about the proper relationship between power and freedom that would ultimately prove irreconcilable. The underlying economic tensions between the two systems intensified during the 440 SBC as Athenian commercial expansion began threatening traditional Spartan spheres of influence. Athenian merchants, protected by the empire's naval supremacy, established trading relationships throughout the western Mediterranean that competed directly with Corinthian commerce. The Athenian colony at Thurii in southern Italy, founded in 444 BC with Pericles' active support, provided a base for further commercial penetration into regions that Corinth and other Peloponnesian cities had traditionally dominated. These economic rivalries created powerful constituencies within the Spartan alliance that viewed Athenian expansion as an existential threat to their prosperity. The immediate causes of the war emerged from a series of local conflicts that escalated beyond their original scope because of the broader tensions between the two alliance systems. The dispute between Corinth and Corcyra over control of Epidamnus in 435 BC initially appeared to be a typical intercity conflict over colonial territories and trade routes. However, Corcyra's appeal to Athens for naval assistance against Corinthian intervention transformed a regional dispute into a confrontation between the major alliance systems. Athens' decision to provide limited naval support to Corcyra, while technically avoiding direct conflict with Corinth, demonstrated the impossibility of maintaining neutrality when every local dispute carried implications for the broader balance of power. The Potidaea crisis of 432 BC further escalated tensions by directly involving an Athenian subject city with strong ties to Corinth. Potidaea, located on the strategically important Pellene Peninsula in the northern Aegean, had been founded by Corinth but had become a tribute-paying member of the Delian League. When Athens demanded that Potidaea expel its Corinthian magistrates and dismantle its fortifications, the city's refusal led to a lengthy siege that required substantial Athenian military resources. The siege's duration and cost demonstrated the difficulties inherent in maintaining imperial control over reluctant subjects while providing Corinth with additional grievances against Athenian interference in traditional spheres of influence. The Megarian decree passed by the Athenian assembly around 432 BC represented perhaps the most provocative of the measures that precipitated open warfare. This economic embargo excluded Megarian merchants from all ports controlled by Athens and its allies, effectively cutting off Megara's access to the commercial networks that sustained its economy. The decree's harsh terms, which prohibited Megarians from entering Athenian territory or allied harbours on pain of death, demonstrated Athens' willingness to use economic warfare as an instrument of imperial policy. For Sparta and its allies, the decree provided clear evidence that Athenian power threatened the economic survival of any city that opposed Athenian interests. Pericles' role in formulating Athenian policy during this crucial period reflected both the strengths and limitations of democratic decision-making in interstate relations. As the dominant political figure in Athens since the 440 SBC, Pericles had consistently advocated for aggressive policies that would maintain and expand Athenian power throughout the Aegean. His famous funeral oration, delivered early in the war to honour Athenian casualties, articulated a vision of Athenian democracy as a model for all humanity that justified imperial expansion as a civilizing mission. However, Pericles' confidence in Athenian superiority led him to underestimate both the duration and intensity of the conflict that his policies had helped create. The Spartan decision to declare war in 431 BC followed extensive deliberations that revealed deep divisions within the Peloponnesian League about the wisdom of challenging Athenian power. King Archidamus II, who would give his name to the war's first phase, argued for caution and diplomatic solutions that might resolve the crisis without the enormous costs and uncertain outcomes of prolonged warfare. His assessment of Athenian strengths, particularly their naval supremacy and financial resources, proved remarkably prescient in anticipating the challenges that Sparta would face in conducting effective military operations against a maritime empire. However, the Corinthian delegation's passionate appeals for immediate action against Athenian aggression ultimately swayed the Spartan assembly toward war. The Corinthians argued that Athenian expansion would continue indefinitely unless checked by military force, eventually reducing all Greek cities to tributary status under Athenian imperial rule. Their prediction that delay would only strengthen Athens while weakening potential resistance resonated with Spartan concerns about maintaining their leadership position within the Peloponnesian alliance system. The strategic challenges facing both sides as warfare began in 431 BC reflected the fundamental asymmetries between land-based and maritime power that would shape the entire conflict. Sparta possessed clear superiority in hoplite warfare, with allied forces totaling perhaps 60,000 heavy infantry, capable of devastating any territory they could reach by land. However, Athenian control of the sea enabled them to avoid decisive land battles while using their naval mobility to strike Spartan territories and allies at will. The famous long walls connecting Athens to its port at Piraeus created an impregnable defensive system that allowed the city to maintain maritime communications even when Spartan forces occupied Attica. The Archidamian War's opening campaigns demonstrated both the effectiveness and limitations of these contrasting strategic approaches. The annual Spartan invasions of Attica, beginning in 431 BC, systematically devastated the countryside surrounding Athens, while forcing the rural population to seek shelter within the city's fortifications. These operations aimed at breaking Athenian morale by destroying the agricultural foundation of their economy, while demonstrating Spartan military superiority to wavering allies. The sight of smoke rising from burning farmsteads throughout Attica created intense psychological pressure on Athenian citizens, who watched helplessly as their ancestral properties suffered destruction. Yet the Athenian strategy of avoiding land battles while conducting naval raids against Peloponnesian coastlines proved equally effective in demonstrating the futility of traditional military approaches against maritime power. Athenian naval expeditions struck targets throughout the Peloponnese, from Methone in Messenia to Prasiae in Laconia, creating economic disruption while forcing Sparta to disperse defensive forces along extensive coastlines. These raids, while individually limited in scope, demonstrated Athens' ability to project power throughout the Greek world while remaining invulnerable to retaliation through conventional military means. The outbreak of plague in Athens during 430 BC fundamentally altered the war's trajectory, while revealing the vulnerabilities inherent in the Athenian defensive strategy. The disease, probably typhus or typhoid fever, spread rapidly through the overcrowded city where rural refugees had sought protection from Spartan invasions. Contemporary accounts describe horrific symptoms including high fever, severe headaches, bleeding from the mouth and nose, and painful skin lesions that often proved fatal within a week of onset. The plague's mortality rate, estimated at between 25 and 35% of the affected population, eliminated perhaps 75,000 Athenians, including many of the skilled craftsmen and experienced rowers who formed the backbone of Athenian military power. The social and political disruption caused by the plague extended far beyond its immediate mortality effects, undermining the civic solidarity that had sustained Athenian democracy through previous crises. Traditional religious practices proved ineffective against the disease, leading many citizens to abandon conventional moral restraints in favour of immediate gratification. The breakdown of funeral customs, as bodies accumulated faster than they could be properly buried, created religious pollution that many interpreted as evidence of divine displeasure with Athenian policies. These psychological effects proved as damaging as the physical casualties in weakening Athenian resolve for continued warfare. Pericles himself became a casualty of both the plague and the political backlash it generated among Athenian citizens seeking scapegoats for their suffering. The assembly's decision to depose him from his generalship in 430 BC, followed by a substantial fine for alleged financial irregularities, demonstrated the volatility of democratic politics under extreme stress. Although the Athenians later re-elected Pericles to office, his death from plague complications in 429 BC deprived Athens of its most experienced and respected political leader at the moment when steady leadership was most crucial for maintaining strategic coherence. The succession struggle that followed Pericles' death brought to prominence political figures whose approaches to warfare differed dramatically from his cautious defensive strategy. Cleon, a wealthy leather merchant who emerged as the leading advocate for aggressive military action, represented a new type of democratic politician who appealed directly to popular emotions rather than relying on aristocratic prestige and oratorical skill. His proposal to execute all adult male citizens of Mytilene after that city's failed revolt in 428 BC demonstrated the harsh measures that democratic assemblies could approve when driven by anger and fear. The Mytilenean debate, as recorded by Thucydides, revealed the moral and practical dilemmas that imperial warfare created for democratic decision-making. The initial assembly vote approving mass executions reflected popular fury at Allied betrayal during a moment of Athenian vulnerability. However, the following day's reconsideration, prompted by second thoughts about the justice and wisdom of such extreme measures, led to a narrow reversal that spared most Mytilenean lives while still imposing harsh punishments on the revolt's leaders. The dramatic race between two triremes carrying contradictory orders to the Athenian commander at Mytilene symbolized the life and death consequences of democratic deliberation in wartime conditions. Cleon's military leadership during the Pylos campaign of 425 BC demonstrated both his political acumen and the unpredictable nature of ancient warfare. When the Athenian general Demosthenes fortified a rocky promontory on the western coast of the Peloponnese, creating a base for raids against Spartan territory, the resulting confrontation trapped a Spartan force on the adjacent island of Sphacteria. Cleon's boastful promise to resolve the situation within 20 days led to his appointment as co-commander of the rescue operation, despite his lack of military experience. The subsequent Athenian victory, which captured 292 Spartan hoplites, including 120 full Spartiates, represented the most shocking military reversal in Spartan history. The psychological impact of the Sphacteria disaster extended far beyond its immediate military consequences, fundamentally altering Greek perceptions of Spartan invincibility that had persisted since the Persian Wars. The sight of Spartan warriors surrendering rather than fighting to the death contradicted the heroic mythology that had sustained Spartan prestige throughout the Greek world. For Athens, the captured Spartans provided both valuable hostages for future negotiations and powerful symbols of democratic military effectiveness that validated aggressive policies advocated by leaders like Cleon. The Spartan response to this humiliation revealed the flexibility that characterized their strategic thinking despite their reputation for rigid conservatism. The appointment of Brasidas as commander of operations in northern Greece represented a fundamental shift from defensive to offensive strategy designed to threaten Athenian interests in regions crucial to their imperial system. Brasidas's march through hostile territory to reach the Chalcidic Peninsula demonstrated remarkable military skill, while his diplomatic success in detaching Athenian allies revealed sophisticated understanding of the political vulnerabilities inherent in imperial systems based on coercion rather than genuine consent. The loss of Amphipolis in 424 BC represented perhaps the most serious blow to Athenian interests during the war's first phase, threatening both crucial timber supplies and the tribute revenues that sustained imperial operations. The city's strategic location on the Strymon River controlled access to the gold and silver mines of Mount Pangaeum, while serving as the administrative centre for Athenian interests throughout the northern Aegean. Brasidas's success in convincing the city to revolt, achieved through promises of autonomy and protection from Athenian retaliation, demonstrated the effectiveness of liberation propaganda against imperial control systems. Thucydides' personal involvement in the Amphipolis crisis as one of the Athenian generals responsible for the city's defence provided him with intimate knowledge of the military and political factors that shaped the conflict's development. His subsequent exile from Athens, imposed as punishment for his failure to prevent the city's loss, enabled him to observe the war from multiple perspectives while gathering information from participants on all sides. This unique position, combined with his analytical intelligence and literary skill, produced the most sophisticated analysis of interstate conflict that the ancient world would produce. The Peace of Nicias, concluded in 421 BC after 10 years of inconclusive warfare, reflected mutual exhaustion rather than decisive victory by either side. The treaty's terms, which provided for the return of captured territories and prisoners while establishing a 50-year alliance between Athens and Sparta, appeared to restore the pre-war status quo. However, the exclusion of key allies from the negotiations, particularly Corinth and the Boeotian cities that had suffered most from Athenian raids, ensured that the underlying tensions responsible for the conflict remained unresolved. The fragility of this peace became apparent almost immediately as both sides violated its terms through support for each other's enemies in regional conflicts. The Spartan alliance with Argos in 420 BC, designed to counter Athenian influence in the Peloponnese, led directly to renewed hostilities that culminated in the Battle of Mantinea in 418 BC. This engagement, the largest hoplite battle fought during the entire war, restored Spartan military prestige while demonstrating that neither side possessed the capability to achieve decisive victory through conventional military means. The emergence of Alcibiades as a dominant figure in Athenian politics during this period introduced new levels of ambition and instability to strategic planning that would ultimately prove catastrophic for Athenian interests. The nephew of Pericles combined remarkable personal charisma with boundless political ambition and a flexible approach to moral constraints that scandalized even his contemporaries. His advocacy for aggressive expansion into new theatres of operation reflected both genuine strategic insight and personal desires for military glory that would enhance his political position within the democratic system. The Sicilian expedition that began in 415 BC represented the most ambitious military undertaking in Greek history, involving over 25,000 Athenian and allied personnel in an attempt to conquer the wealthy cities of Sicily and southern Italy. The expedition's official justification focused on assisting the city of Segesta against Syracuse, but the true objectives involved establishing Athenian control over the western Mediterranean's grain supplies and commercial networks. Success would have provided Athens with resources sufficient to dominate the entire Greek world, while eliminating any possibility of effective resistance to imperial expansion. The scale of preparation for this expedition demonstrated both Athenian wealth and the Democratic Assembly's capacity for approving massive resource commitments based on optimistic projections of future gains. The fleet that departed from Piraeus in June 415 BC included 134 triremes manned by over 27,000 rowers, plus transport vessels carrying 5,100 hoplites and additional light infantry, cavalry and siege equipment. The expedition's cost, estimated at over 2,000 talents for the first year alone, exceeded the annual tribute income from the entire Delian League, while requiring additional emergency taxes on wealthy citizens. However, the expedition's leadership structure reflected the political compromises necessary to maintain democratic support, rather than military effectiveness requirements. The appointment of 3 co-equal generals, Alcibiades, Nicias and Lamachus, with fundamentally different strategic approaches, virtually guaranteed confusion and delay in crucial decision-making. Nicias, who had opposed the expedition from its inception, advocated for limited objectives and cautious tactics that minimized risks but also reduced prospects for decisive success. Alcibiades favored aggressive action designed to achieve rapid conquest through bold strokes that would overwhelm enemy resistance before it could organize effectively. The recall of Alcibiades to face charges related to the mutilation of the Herms, sacred statues defaced throughout Athens on the eve of the expedition's departure, eliminated the expedition's most charismatic and strategically flexible leader, while creating a dangerous enemy who possessed intimate knowledge of Athenian plans and capabilities. Alcibiades' flight to Sparta, rather than returning to face trial, provided the Spartans with crucial intelligence about Athenian objectives, while enabling him to advocate for countermeasures that would prove devastatingly effective against his former compatriots. The siege of Syracuse that dominated the expedition's second year demonstrated both the potential effectiveness and ultimate limitations of Athenian military methods when applied to large-scale territorial conquest. The Athenian construction of siege walls designed to encircle the city represented sophisticated engineering that initially appeared likely to force Syracusan surrender through starvation. However, the arrival of Spartan reinforcements under Gylippus, acting on intelligence provided by Alcibiades, enabled the defenders to complete counterwalls that prevented Athenian encirclement while opening supply lines to the interior. The transformation of the siege from an Athenian offensive operation into a desperate defensive struggle reflected the fundamental strategic miscalculations that had shaped the expedition from its inception. Rather than achieving rapid conquest through superior naval mobility and tactical skill, the Athenians found themselves trapped in a prolonged land campaign that negated their primary military advantages while exposing them to the type of infantry warfare in which their enemies excelled. The arrival of additional Syracusan allies from throughout Sicily and southern Italy gradually shifted the numerical balance against the Athenians, while their own reinforcements proved insufficient to restore offensive capabilities. Nicias's final attempt to salvage the situation through a massive night attack on the Syracusan counterwalls in 413 BC ended in complete disaster that sealed the expedition's fate. The confused fighting in darkness led to numerous friendly fire casualties while failing to achieve any of its tactical objectives. The Athenian retreat from their siege positions, conducted under constant harassment from Syracusan cavalry and light infantry, degenerated into a rout that culminated in the complete destruction of both the original expedition and the substantial reinforcements that had been sent to rescue it. The final battles at the Asinaros River represented one of the most complete military disasters in ancient history, with virtually the entire Athenian force either killed or captured during the chaotic retreat from Syracuse. The death of Nicias and the enslavement of thousands of Athenian citizens in Syracusan stone quarries symbolized the magnitude of the catastrophe, while demonstrating the brutal realities of interstate warfare when conducted without restraint. The expedition's failure eliminated approximately 1/3 of Athens's adult male citizen population, while exhausting the financial resources that had sustained imperial operations for over half a century. The catastrophic destruction of the Sicilian expedition had eliminated Athens as a dominant military power, while simultaneously demonstrating to the entire Greek world that even the most powerful polis could suffer complete strategic collapse through overextension and miscalculation. The loss of over 200 ships and 40,000 men represented more than a military defeat. It marked the beginning of a fundamental transformation in Greek interstate relations that would ultimately destroy the polis system's capacity for independent action. As news of the disaster reached Athens in the autumn of 413 BC, the immediate response revealed both the resilience and the underlying fragility of democratic institutions under extreme stress. The Athenian Assembly's decision to continue the war, despite facing seemingly impossible odds, demonstrated the stubborn determination that had characterized democratic decision-making throughout the Peloponnesian conflict. Emergency measures included the melting down of gold and silver dedications from the Acropolis temples to fund new ship construction, the liberation of slaves for naval service in exchange for citizenship, and the recall of political exiles whose military experience might prove valuable in the desperate struggle for survival. These unprecedented steps reflected the Assembly's recognition that defeat would mean not merely the loss of empire but the complete destruction of the democratic system that had defined Athenian identity for over a century. However, the oligarchic revolution of 411 BC revealed the extent to which prolonged warfare had undermined the social cohesion necessary for democratic governance. The conspiracy led by Antiphon, Peisander, and other wealthy citizens exploited popular frustration with military failures, while promising more effective leadership through the concentration of power in fewer hands. The establishment of the Council of 400, which replaced the democratic assembly with an oligarchic body, drawn exclusively from the wealthiest citizens, initially received support from citizens exhausted by the costs and casualties of democratic decision-making in wartime conditions. The oligarchs promised to secure Persian financial support through the restoration of Alcibiades proved illusory, as the exiled general's negotiations with Tissaphernes had been designed primarily to enhance his own bargaining position rather than genuinely assist either side. When it became clear that Persian aid would not materialize and that the oligarchy intended to make peace with Sparta on terms that would effectively end Athenian independence, the democratic forces centered around the fleet at Samos organized successful resistance that restored popular government after only 4 months of oligarchic rule. The final phase of the Peloponnesian War, from 411 to 404 BC, witnessed a remarkable Athenian recovery that demonstrated the continuing vitality of democratic institutions when supported by effective military leadership. The victories at Kynossema, Abydos and Cyzicus between 411 and 410 BC restored Athenian control over the Hellespont, while eliminating much of the Spartan fleet that had threatened Athenian grain supplies from the Black Sea colonies. These successes, achieved through the tactical innovations of commanders like Alcibiades and Thrasybulus, proved that Athenian naval supremacy could still be decisive when properly coordinated with strategic objectives. The Battle of Arginae in 406 BC represented both the pinnacle of this democratic resurgence and the beginning of its ultimate collapse through internal political conflicts. The Athenian fleet of 150 triremes, manned largely by hastily trained crews including slaves promised freedom for their service, defeated a Spartan force of 120 ships while killing the enemy admiral Callicratidas and capturing or destroying over 70 vessels. This victory eliminated the immediate threat to Athenian communications with their remaining allies, while demonstrating that democratic motivation could still overcome professional military advantages when circumstances favoured Athenian tactical strengths. Yet the aftermath of Arginae revealed the destructive potential of democratic decision-making when driven by emotional responses rather than rational analysis. The failure to rescue survivors from damaged Athenian ships, caused by a sudden storm that prevented the designated rescue vessels from reaching the battle site, created public outrage that the assembly channeled against the victorious generals. The trial and execution of 6 of the 8 commanders, including Pericles' son, eliminated Athens' most experienced naval leaders, while demonstrating to potential successors the personal risks involved in accepting military responsibility during democratic governance. This self-destructive tendency reached its climax at Mesopotamia in 405 BC, where the inexperienced commanders who had replaced the executed generals allowed Lysander to destroy virtually the entire remaining Athenian fleet through a surprise attack on beached vessels. The disaster occurred because the new Athenian commanders ignored basic security precautions while their crews dispersed to forage for food, creating an opportunity that the Spartan admiral exploited with devastating effectiveness. The loss of 160 triremes and their crews eliminated Athens' capacity for continued naval operations, while exposing the city to complete blockade by enemy forces. The siege of Athens during the winter of 404 BC demonstrated both the effectiveness of Spartan strategic planning under Lysander's direction and the ultimate dependence of imperial systems on continued military success. The Spartan blockade of Piraeus, combined with the occupation of Decelia that prevented agricultural production in Attica, created famine conditions that forced the Athenian assembly to accept unconditional surrender. The demolition of the long walls to the sound of flute music, as reported by contemporary sources, symbolized the end of the imperial system that had dominated the Aegean for over half a century. The Spartan victory in 404 BC established a hegemonic system that differed fundamentally from Athenian imperialism in its methods and objectives, yet proved equally unstable in its long-term consequences. Lysander's installation of oligarchic governments throughout the former Athenian Empire, supported by Spartan garrisons and local collaborators known as Dicaches, aimed at creating a network of dependent allies rather than tribute-paying subjects. These puppet regimes, composed of wealthy citizens who had opposed democratic governments, initially welcomed Spartan support as protection against popular movements that might restore democratic institutions. However, the harshness of these oligarchic governments quickly generated opposition that undermined Spartan authority throughout the Greek world. In Athens itself, the 30 tyrants led by Critias implemented a reign of terror that eliminated over 1,500 citizens while confiscating property to reward their supporters and pay Spartan garrison costs. The execution of Theramenes, one of the 30 who had advocated for more moderate policies, demonstrated the extremism that characterized these collaborative regimes, while alienating potential supporters who might have accepted limited oligarchic reforms. The democratic restoration led by Thrasybulus in 403 BC revealed both the continuing appeal of popular government and the limitations of Spartan military resources for maintaining control over unwilling populations. The initial force of only 70 exiles who occupied Phyle a fortress in the mountains northeast of Athens, grew rapidly as citizens fled the capital to escape oligarchic persecution. The subsequent battles at Mynikia and in the Piraeus demonstrated that Spartan hoplite superiority could be neutralized by determined resistance fighters familiar with local terrain and supported by sympathetic populations. King Pausanias's decision to negotiate a compromise settlement that restored democratic government while granting amnesty to most oligarchic collaborators reflected growing Spartan concerns about the costs of maintaining imperial control through military occupation. The agreement preserved Spartan hegemony in foreign policy while allowing Athens to resume democratic governance in domestic affairs, creating a precedent for the indirect control methods that would characterize the new hegemonial system. However, this compromise also demonstrated the inherent instability of arrangements that depended on the continued cooperation of formerly independent communities with fundamentally different political values. The broader challenges facing Spartan hegemony became apparent as similar resistance movements emerged throughout the former Athenian Empire and beyond. The Spartan attempt to extend their control into Asia Minor through campaigns against Persian territories brought them into conflict with Artaxerxes II, who responded by providing financial support to anti-Spartan coalitions within Greece itself. The Persian strategy of using Greek mercenaries and subsidies to maintain a balance of power that prevented any single Greek state from achieving lasting dominance proved remarkably effective in exploiting the competitive dynamics that characterized interstate relations. The expedition of Cyrus the Younger in 401 BC, which included 10,000 Greek mercenaries recruited largely from Peloponnesian cities, demonstrated both the military effectiveness of Greek professional soldiers and the extent to which economic pressures had undermined traditional citizen-soldier systems. These mercenaries, whose retreat through hostile territory after Cyrus's death at Cunaxa became legendary through Xenophons and Arbaces, represented a new type of military force that fought for pay rather than patriotic loyalty. Their success against Persian armies revealed tactical advantages that would increasingly attract Greek communities facing financial constraints that made citizen militias difficult to maintain. The Corinthian War that began in 395 BC marked the first major challenge to Spartan hegemony from a coalition that included Athens, Thebes, Corinth and Argos, supported by substantial Persian financial assistance. The conflict's origins lay in Spartan interference in local disputes that violated the autonomy principles supposedly guaranteed by the hegemonic system. When Sparta supported Phocian claims against Locrian territory and intervened in Boeotian affairs to weaken Theban influence, they created the coalition that would challenge their dominance for nearly a decade. The Battle of Halatus in 395 BC, where the Spartan general Lysander was killed during an unsuccessful assault on the Boeotian city, demonstrated that Spartan military supremacy was not invincible when facing determined resistance supported by adequate resources. The defeat shocked the Greek world by eliminating one of Sparta's most successful commanders, while revealing tactical limitations in traditional hoplite warfare when conducted against prepared defensive positions. The psychological impact of Lysander's death extended beyond its immediate military consequences, encouraging further resistance to Spartan authority throughout the Greek world. The subsequent campaigns revealed the fundamental strategic problems that would plague Spartan hegemony throughout the 4th century BC. Unlike Athens, which had possessed the naval resources necessary for projecting power throughout the Mediterranean, Sparta lacked the financial and logistical capabilities required for maintaining simultaneous military operations across multiple theatres. The need to garrison hostile cities while conducting active campaigns against coalition forces stretched Spartan manpower beyond sustainable limits, forcing them to rely increasingly on mercenary forces whose loyalty depended on regular payment rather than patriotic commitment. The naval battle of Cnidus in 394 BC, where a Persian fleet commanded by the Athenian exile, Conon destroyed the Spartan navy, eliminated the maritime capabilities that Sparta had acquired through Persian support during the final phase of the Peloponnesian War. This defeat restored Athenian access to their traditional allies in the Aegean, while enabling the reconstruction of the long walls that had protected Athens during its imperial period. The Persian decision to support Athenian naval revival demonstrated the effectiveness of balance of power diplomacy in preventing any Greek state from achieving the hegemonic dominance that might threaten Persian interests. However, the restoration of Athenian naval power also created new tensions within the anti-Spartan coalition, as Athens began pursuing policies that resembled their earlier imperial ambitions. The establishment of the Second Athenian League in 378 BC, ostensibly organized as a defensive alliance against Spartan aggression, gradually developed characteristics that reminded potential members of the oppressive tribute system that had characterized the Delian League. Despite constitutional provisions that prohibited tribute collection and guaranteed member autonomy, Athenian behavior toward allies like Melos and Syros suggested that imperial instincts remained strong within democratic political culture. The emergence of Thebes as a major military power during this period represented the most significant challenge to traditional assumptions about Greek military capabilities and political organization. The Theban Sacred Band, an elite unit of 150 pairs of lovers organized by Epaminondas and Pelopidas around 378 BC, revolutionized infantry tactics through innovations that would influence military development throughout the Hellenistic period. The unit's organization around homosexual partnerships, based on the theory that lovers would fight more fiercely to protect each other than ordinary soldiers motivated by abstract patriotic duty, created unprecedented levels of unit cohesion and tactical effectiveness. The Sacred Band's tactical innovations extended beyond its unique social organization to include new approaches to phalanx warfare that challenged Spartan military supremacy. The development of the oblique formation, which concentrated superior numbers against one wing of the enemy line while refusing engagement elsewhere, enabled smaller forces to achieve local superiority that could break enemy formations before their numerical advantages became decisive. These tactics required extensive training and precise coordination that only professional military units could achieve, marking a departure from citizen soldier systems towards specialized warfare conducted by military experts. The liberation of Messenia following the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC represented the most dramatic reversal of fortune in Greek military history, transforming Sparta from the dominant land power into a minor regional state within a single campaign season. The Theban victory, achieved through the tactical innovations of Epaminondas and the disciplined fighting of the Sacred Band, killed over 1,000 Spartans, including King Cleombrotus, while demonstrating the vulnerability of traditional phalanx formations to innovative tactical approaches. The psychological impact of this defeat shattered the aura of Spartan invincibility that had dominated Greek military thinking since the Persian Wars. The Theban invasion of Laconia that followed Leuctra marked the first foreign penetration of Spartan home territory since the Dorian migrations over 6 centuries earlier. Epaminondas's decision to march directly on Sparta itself, while ultimately unsuccessful due to the city's defensive preparations, demonstrated that Spartan military power could no longer protect even their own territory from enemy attack. The sight of enemy forces devastating the Eurotas Valley, previously considered inviolable, created panic among Spartan citizens while encouraging Helot rebellions that further weakened the state's military capabilities. The establishment of Messene as an independent polis in 369 BC eliminated the agricultural foundation upon which Spartan society had been built for over 3 centuries. The liberation of the Messenian Helots, who provided the agricultural labour that freed Spartan citizens for military service, forced a fundamental reorganization of Spartan society that destroyed the institutional basis of their military system. Without helot labour to support them, Spartan citizens could no longer devote their entire lives to military training, while the loss of Messenian agricultural production eliminated the economic surplus that had sustained their professional military establishment. The demographic consequences of this transformation proved even more devastating than the immediate military effects. The Spartan citizen body, which had already declined from approximately 8,000 adult males in 480 BC to perhaps 2,000 by 371 BC due to warfare casualties and the rigid social requirements for maintaining citizenship status, fell to fewer than 1,000 after Leuctra. This demographic collapse reflected not only battle losses, but also the economic pressures that forced many Spartans to abandon the communal dining system and military training that defined citizenship within their society. The rise of Macedon under Philip II during the 360s and 350s BC initially appeared to represent simply another example of the peripheral kingdom expansion that had occasionally disrupted Greek politics without fundamentally altering the polis system's basic structure. The Macedonian monarchy had traditionally played a marginal role in Greek affairs, serving primarily as a source of timber and precious metals for the more developed southern cities while remaining politically fragmented under weak rulers who struggled to maintain control over their own nobility. Philip's accession to the throne in 359 BC as regent for his infant nephew Amyntas IV seemed unlikely to change this pattern, particularly given the military pressures from Illyrian tribes and the political instability that had characterized recent Macedonian history. However, Philip's military reforms and territorial expansion during the 350 SBC created a new type of state that combined Greek military techniques with Macedonian social organization and Persian administrative methods. The development of the Macedonian phalanx, which extended the traditional hoplite formation through the use of longer spears called sarissas and deeper formations of up to 16 ranks, created tactical advantages that proved decisive against traditional Greek infantry. The sarissa's length of approximately 18 feet enabled Macedonian phalangites to engage enemy formations before traditional 8-foot spears could reach them, while the deeper formations provided greater staying power in prolonged combat. The integration of cavalry, light infantry and siege equipment into coordinated tactical systems gave Philip's armies capabilities that no traditional Greek polis could match through citizen soldier levies. The companion cavalry, recruited from Macedonian nobility and equipped with long lances for shock combat, provided the mobile striking power necessary for exploiting gaps created by phalanx attacks. The development of sophisticated siege equipment, including torsion catapults and mobile towers, enabled Macedonian forces to reduce fortified cities that had previously been immune to assault through traditional hoplite tactics. The social organization that supported these military innovations drew upon Macedonian traditions of personal loyalty between kings and nobles, while incorporating Greek concepts of military professionalism and Persian administrative efficiency. The companion system created bonds between Philip and his aristocratic followers that transcended traditional polis concepts of citizenship, establishing personal relationships that could survive military defeats and political setbacks. The extension of Macedonian citizenship to conquered populations, combined with the integration of local elites into the royal administration, created a flexible system for incorporating diverse territories under unified control. Philip's intervention in the Third Sacred War provided the opportunity for extending Macedonian influence into central Greece, while demonstrating the military effectiveness of his reformed army against traditional Greek opponents. The conflict, which began as a dispute over Phocian cultivation of sacred land at Delphi, escalated into a general war when the Phocians used temple treasures to hire mercenary armies that could challenge Theban and Thessalian forces. Philip's alliance with Thebes against the Phocians enabled him to present Macedonian expansion as defense of religious sanctity, while gaining practical experience in Greek warfare conditions. The Battle of the Crocus Field in 352 BC, where Philip's forces defeated a Phocian army led by Onomarchus, demonstrated both the tactical superiority of Macedonian military organisation and Philip's sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare. The execution of 3,000 Phocian prisoners, justified as punishment for sacrilege against Apollo, created terror among Philip's enemies while establishing his reputation as a commander who combined military effectiveness with religious devotion. The victory also secured Macedonian control over Thessaly, providing access to superior cavalry forces and the agricultural resources necessary for supporting extended military campaigns. The expansion of Macedonian power during the 340 SBC occurred through a combination of military conquest, diplomatic manipulation, and economic pressure that gradually eliminated the independence of Greek city-states without provoking unified resistance. Philip's siege techniques, demonstrated during the capture of Amphiplis in 357 BC and Olynthus in 348 BC, proved that traditional fortifications could not protect cities that lack the resources for prolonged resistance. The systematic destruction of Olynthus and the enslavement of its population served as an example to other cities considering resistance to Macedonian expansion. The diplomatic revolution that accompanied this military expansion involved the systematic exploitation of traditional Greek interstate rivalries to prevent effective coalition formation against Macedonian power. Philip's support for different factions within individual cities created internal conflicts that weakened potential opponents while providing pretexts for intervention. The use of bribery to influence political decisions within democratic assemblies proved particularly effective in Athens, where politicians like Askina received Macedonian gold in exchange for advocating policies that served Philip's interests. The economic pressures that Philip applied against resistant cities demonstrated the extent to which Greek independence had become vulnerable to external manipulation through control of trade routes and resource supplies. The Macedonian occupation of the Thracian coast eliminated Athenian access to Black Sea grain supplies, while providing Philip with the gold mines of Mount Pangaeum that financed his military expansion. The annual income of over 1,000 talents from these mines exceeded the tribute revenues that had sustained the Athenian Empire at its peak, enabling Philip to maintain professional armies and conduct extensive diplomatic operations simultaneously. The transformation of Greek military culture during this period reflected broader social changes that had undermined the citizen-soldier ideal upon which the polis system had been based. The increasing reliance on mercenary forces, driven by the economic pressures of prolonged warfare and the technical demands of professional military service, created armies whose loyalty depended on regular payment rather than patriotic commitment. These professional soldiers, drawn from throughout the Greek world and beyond, possessed superior training and equipment compared to citizen militias, but they lacked the political motivation that had sustained Greek resistance during the Persian Wars. The decline of citizen participation in military service had profound implications for political development within individual poleis, as the separation of military and political functions undermined the reciprocal relationship between rights and obligations that had defined classical Greek citizenship. Citizens who no longer served as soldiers lost both the practical experience of collective action and the moral authority that military service had traditionally provided for political participation. The resulting disconnect between political decision-making and military implementation created strategic incoherence that professional enemies like Philip could exploit through superior coordination of diplomatic and military policies. The social consequences of this military transformation extended beyond immediate political effects to include fundamental changes in Greek cultural values and social organisation. The heroic ideal of citizen soldiers fighting for their homeland's independence gave way to pragmatic calculations about the costs and benefits of resistance to superior force. The increasing frequency of surrender and collaboration, as demonstrated during Philip's campaigns against Greek cities, reflected not merely military weakness, but a transformation in civic culture that prioritized individual survival over collective honor. The assassination of Philip II in 336 BC at his daughter's wedding celebration in Aegae created a succession crisis that threatened to unravel the Macedonian hegemony over Greece before it had fully consolidated. The 20-year-old Alexander, despite his royal birth and careful preparation for kingship, faced immediate challenges from rival claimants, restive Greek cities that saw opportunity in the transition, and barbarian tribes along Macedonia's northern frontiers who interpreted Philip's death as weakness. The young prince's response to these multiple threats would demonstrate both the military genius inherited from his father and the unprecedented ambition that would transform the ancient world within a single generation. Alexander's education under Aristotle at Mieza had provided him with intellectual foundations that distinguished him sharply from previous Macedonian rulers, who had typically focused on military prowess and political survival, rather than broader cultural and philosophical concerns. The philosopher's systematic approach to natural science, political theory, and ethics created in Alexander a synthetic mind capable of integrating diverse knowledge systems while maintaining focus on practical objectives. Aristotle's emphasis on the superiority of Greek civilization over barbarian cultures would profoundly influence Alexander's later policies, though the student would ultimately transcend his teacher's narrow ethnic prejudices through direct experience with Persian and other Eastern societies. The curriculum at Mieza included intensive study of Homer's epics, which provided Alexander with heroic models that shaped his self-conception throughout his career. The young prince's identification with Achilles, reinforced by his mother Olympias's claims of descent from the legendary hero, created psychological motivations that extended far beyond rational strategic calculations. Alexander's decision to visit Troy at the beginning of his Asian campaign, where he honoured Achilles at his tomb while his companion Hephaestion honoured Patroclus, demonstrated the extent to which literary inspiration influenced his understanding of his historical role. Military training formed the practical complement to this intellectual education, as Alexander participated in Philip's campaigns from adolescence while receiving instruction in tactics, strategy, and the technical aspects of siege warfare. His command of the companion cavalry at Chaeronea in 338 BC, where the 18-year-old prince led the decisive charge that broke the Theban sacred band, provided crucial battlefield experience while demonstrating his capacity for independent command under pressure. The complete destruction of this elite unit, which had dominated Greek warfare for over 3 decades, marked both the end of traditional polis military systems and Alexander's emergence as a military leader of exceptional capability. The consolidation of power following Philip's assassination required swift action against multiple threats that could have destroyed Macedonian hegemony if allowed to develop simultaneously. Alexander's execution of potential rival claimants, including his cousin Amyntas IV and several noble conspirators, eliminated domestic challenges while demonstrating the ruthlessness that would characterize his treatment of opposition throughout his career. The speed and thoroughness of these purges reflected both careful preparation and Alexander's understanding that mercy toward enemies could be interpreted as weakness in the violent world of Macedonian court politics. The Greek revolt that erupted immediately after Philip's death tested Alexander's capacity for managing the complex political relationships that sustained Macedonian control over the southern cities. Demosthenes in Athens and other anti-Macedonian leaders interpreted the succession crisis as an opportunity to restore Greek independence, organising resistance coalitions while seeking Persian financial support for renewed warfare. Alexander's rapid march south with 35,000 troops demonstrated both the mobility of Macedonian forces and his appreciation of the psychological factors that influenced political decision-making in democratic assemblies. The submission of the Greek cities without significant resistance revealed the extent to which Philip's military reputation had undermined Greek confidence in their capacity for successful resistance. The League of Corinth's recognition of Alexander as hegemon, following his father's precedent, provided legal legitimacy for Macedonian leadership while maintaining the fiction of Greek autonomy under confederate arrangements. However, Alexander's youth and inexperience encouraged some cities to test his resolve through limited acts of defiance that required careful calibration between firmness and restraint. The Theban revolt of 335 BC provided Alexander with the opportunity to establish his reputation for decisive action, while demonstrating to other Greek cities the consequences of challenging Macedonian authority. The uprising, encouraged by rumours of Alexander's death during his Balkan campaigns, reflected genuine Theban hopes for independence rather than mere opportunistic rebellion. The siege that followed tested both Alexander's military capabilities and his political judgment, as excessive harshness might provoke broader Greek resistance, while insufficient punishment could encourage further revolts. The systematic destruction of Thebes, accomplished through 3 days of methodical demolition that left only temples and the house of the poet Pindar standing, created shock throughout the Greek world while establishing Alexander's reputation for combining military effectiveness with cultural sensitivity. The enslavement of the surviving population, numbering approximately 30,000 individuals, provided both practical benefits through slave sales and symbolic demonstration of the costs of resistance. The decision to spare Athens, despite that city's support for the revolt, demonstrated Alexander's sophisticated understanding of the political calculations necessary for maintaining Greek cooperation during his planned Persian campaign. The Balkan campaigns of 335 BC, conducted while Greek cities contemplated rebellion, revealed Alexander's capacity for managing multiple strategic challenges simultaneously while maintaining the initiative against diverse enemies. The expedition against the Triballi and Getae along the Danube demonstrated Macedonian tactical flexibility in terrain unsuited to traditional phalanx formations. The river crossing, accomplished through improvised boat bridges and coordinated amphibious operations, showcased engineering capabilities that would prove crucial during later Asian campaigns. The Illyrian campaign that followed tested Alexander's ability to operate in mountainous terrain against enemies familiar with guerrilla warfare techniques. The battle at Pelion, where Alexander's forces were initially trapped in a narrow valley by superior numbers, demonstrated both the dangers of overconfidence and the tactical innovations that distinguished his generalship. The coordinated use of phalanx movements, cavalry charges, and light infantry attacks to break free from encirclement established patterns that would characterize Alexander's approach to complex tactical situations throughout his career. The decision to invade the Persian Empire in 334 BC represented the culmination of plans that Philip had developed, but also reflected Alexander's personal ambitions that extended far beyond his father's more limited objectives. Philip's preparations had focused on liberating the Greek cities of Asia Minor, while securing Macedonia's eastern frontiers, goals that could have been accomplished through relatively modest territorial gains. Alexander's vision encompassed the complete conquest of the Persian Empire and the creation of a new world order that would unite East and West under Macedonian leadership. The army that crossed the Hellespont in spring 334 BC reflected both Macedonian military innovations and the diverse human resources available to Alexander through his father's conquests and alliances. The corps consisted of approximately 12,000 Macedonian infantry, organised in 6 phalanx battalions, each recruited from specific regions and commanded by nobles with personal ties to the royal house. The 1,800 companion cavalry represented the elite striking force whose shock tactics would prove decisive in major battles. while 1,500 Thessalian cavalry provided additional mounted strength with different tactical capabilities. The inclusion of Greek allied contingents totaling nearly 7,000 hoplites served both military and political functions, providing experienced infantry while demonstrating Greek participation in the campaign against their traditional Persian enemies. The Agrianians and other Balkan light infantry contributed specialized skills in skirmishing and mountain warfare that complemented the heavy formations, while Cretan archers and Thracian javelin men provided missile capabilities essential for siege operations and irregular warfare. The logistical preparations for this expedition demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the supply requirements for extended operations in hostile territory. The baggage train included siege equipment, engineering tools, and specialized personnel capable of constructing bridges, siege engines, and field fortifications as circumstances required. The inclusion of historians, philosophers, scientists, and artists reflected Alexander's intention to document and study the territories he conquered while preserving knowledge for future administrative purposes. The Battle of the Granicus River in May 334 BZ established the tactical patterns that would characterize Alexander's major victories, while demonstrating his personal courage and tactical flexibility. The Persian defensive position along the river's eastern bank, reinforced by Greek mercenaries under Memnon of Rhodes, created a formidable obstacle that conventional military wisdom suggested should be avoided through flanking maneuvers. Alexander's decision to attack directly across the river reflected both confidence in his troops' capabilities and understanding of the psychological factors that influenced ancient battlefield morale. The initial cavalry engagement in the shallow water saw Alexander personally leading the companion charge against Persian nobles who recognized the strategic importance of killing the Macedonian king. The young commander's conspicuous white-plumed helmet and ornate armour made him a target for concentrated enemy attacks that nearly proved fatal when the Persian noble Spithridates struck him with a battle-axe. The timely intervention of Clytus the Black, who killed Spithridates as he prepared to deliver a finishing blow, demonstrated both the personal risks Alexander accepted and the loyalty his charismatic leadership inspired among his followers. The collapse of Persian resistance following the cavalry breakthrough enabled Macedonian infantry to cross the river and engage the Greek mercenaries who formed the enemy's most reliable troops. Alexander's decision to offer no quarter to these Greeks, whom he considered traitors for serving Persian masters against their own people, resulted in the massacre of approximately 2,000 men and the enslavement of 2,000 survivors. This harsh treatment served both practical and symbolic purposes, eliminating experienced enemies while demonstrating the consequences of opposing Alexander's mission to liberate Greek cities from barbarian rule. The liberation of the Greek cities along the Asian coast following Granicus demonstrated Alexander's sophisticated approach to political administration in conquered territories. The restoration of democratic governments in cities like Ephesus and Miletus, combined with the abolition of tribute payments to Persian authorities, created genuine popular support for Macedonian rule, while providing practical benefits that validated Alexander's propaganda about Greek liberation. However, the installation of Macedonian garrisons and the appointment of loyal officials revealed the limits of this autonomy and the practical requirements for maintaining control over strategic territories. The siege of Halicarnassus in autumn 334 BC provided Alexander with his first major test against sophisticated defensive fortifications designed by Greek military engineers in Persian service. The city's strong position on a peninsula protected by massive walls and defended by Memnon's professional forces required systematic siege operations that demonstrated Macedonian capabilities in this specialized form of warfare. The construction of siege towers, battering rams, and catapults under enemy fire tested both engineering skills and the discipline of troops operating in dangerous conditions. The prolonged nature of this siege, lasting several months with heavy casualties on both sides, revealed the limitations of Alexander's preference for rapid, decisive operations. The defenders' use of countermining, sally attacks, and incendiary weapons created conditions that favoured their superior knowledge of local terrain and defensive preparations. Alexander's eventual success in breaching the walls and forcing Persian evacuation by sea demonstrated persistence and adaptability, but also highlighted the costs of attacking well-prepared positions defended by competent enemies. The winter campaign in Lycia and Pamphylia during 333 BC showcased Alexander's determination to secure his lines of communication while establishing Macedonian authority throughout Asia Minor. The mountainous terrain and scattered fortified cities required different tactical approaches than the major battles that had established his reputation, testing his ability to conduct systematic territorial conquest rather than dramatic military victories. The submission of cities like Xanthos and Phasaelis through negotiation rather than siege demonstrated political skills that complemented his military capabilities. The famous march along the Pamphylian coast, where Alexander's forces traversed beaches that were normally impassable due to high tides, became legendary as an example of divine favour supporting his mission. Whether accomplished through careful timing of tidal conditions or simply good fortune, this achievement enhanced Alexander's reputation for supernatural assistance while providing practical access to territories that might otherwise have required lengthy siege operations. The psychological impact on both followers and enemies contributed to the aura of invincibility that became crucial to Alexander's later successes. The Persian strategic response to Alexander's initial victories revealed both the empire's military resources and the political divisions that would ultimately contribute to its collapse. Darius III's decision to personally command the imperial army demonstrated recognition of the threat Alexander posed, while the mobilization of forces from throughout the empire showed the vast human resources available to Persian leadership. However, the ethnic diversity of these forces, combined with communication difficulties and conflicting tactical traditions, created coordination problems that Macedonian unity and tactical coherence could exploit. The Battle of Issus in November 333 BC represented the first direct confrontation between Alexander and Darius, establishing personal rivalry that would drive both commanders to increasingly desperate measures. The narrow coastal plain where the armies met favoured Macedonian tactical advantages while limiting Persian numerical superiority, creating conditions that Alexander's battlefield management could exploit effectively. The Persian decision to fight in this restricted terrain reflected either overconfidence or strategic miscalculation that played directly into Macedonian strengths. The tactical deployment at Issus demonstrated Alexander's mature understanding of combined arms coordination and his ability to adapt standard formations to specific battlefield conditions. The placement of the phalanx in the centre, supported by Hypaspis on the right and Greek allies on the left, created a solid infantry line capable of withstanding Persian attacks while providing a stable base for cavalry operations. The positioning of the companion cavalry on the right wing, where Alexander would personally lead the decisive charge, reflected both tactical calculation and his preference for commanding from the point of maximum danger. The battle's development followed patterns that would characterize Alexander's major victories, beginning with preliminary skirmishing that tested enemy dispositions and identified tactical opportunities. The Persian advance across the Pinarus River created disorder in their formations that Alexander exploited through precisely timed cavalry charges coordinated with infantry advances. The king's personal leadership of the companion charge against the Persian left wing, aimed directly at Darius's position in the centre, demonstrated both tactical insight and the psychological warfare that Alexander understood to be crucial for achieving decisive results. The collapse of Persian resistance following Darius's flight from the battlefield eliminated organised opposition while providing Alexander with enormous prestige and material resources. The capture of the Persian royal family, including Darius's mother, wife, and children, created both propaganda opportunities and diplomatic leverage for future negotiations. Alexander's respectful treatment of these captives, whom he maintained in royal luxury while refusing to exploit them for personal gratification, demonstrated political sophistication that enhanced his reputation among Persian nobles, who might consider transferring their loyalty to the conqueror. The enormous wealth captured at Issus, including the Persian royal treasury and personal possessions of the empire's elite, provided financial resources that transformed the expedition's strategic possibilities. The 3,000 talents of coined money combined with precious objects worth additional thousands of talents eliminated the financial constraints that had limited previous Greek military operations. This windfall enabled Alexander to maintain his army indefinitely, while funding the administrative apparatus necessary for governing conquered territories. The siege of Tyre in 332 BC represented Alexander's most challenging military undertaking to date, testing his determination against a virtually impregnable island fortress, defended by experienced sailors and marines. The city's position on an island separated from the mainland by half a mile of deep water made conventional siege techniques impossible, while its powerful navy could disrupt any attempted blockade. The 7-month siege that followed demonstrated both Alexander's engineering capabilities and his refusal to accept strategic obstacles as insurmountable. The construction of a causeway connecting the island to the mainland represented one of the most ambitious engineering projects in ancient military history, requiring the labour of thousands of workers under constant enemy harassment. The Tyrians' use of fire ships, diving attacks on the causeway foundations, and coordinated naval assaults created enormous difficulties that repeatedly threatened to make the project impossible. Alexander's persistence in continuing construction despite these setbacks revealed both his strategic understanding of Tyre's importance and his psychological need to overcome any challenge to his authority. The eventual capture of Tyre through coordinated land and sea assaults demonstrated the effectiveness of Alexander's adaptive strategic thinking and his ability to acquire new capabilities as circumstances required. The assembly of a fleet from Phoenician cities that had submitted to Macedonian authority provided the naval power necessary to challenge Tyrian control of the surrounding waters. The development of siege techniques suitable for attacks from both land and sea showcased the technical expertise that Alexander's engineers had accumulated through previous campaigns. The destruction of Tyre and the crucifixion of 2,000 defenders served both strategic and symbolic purposes, eliminating a major naval base that could threaten Macedonian communications, while demonstrating the consequences of prolonged resistance. The enslavement of 30,000 survivors provided economic benefits, while removing potential sources of future rebellion. However, the severity of these punishments also reveal the darker aspects of Alexander's character and his willingness to use extreme violence when his authority was challenged. The conquest of Egypt in 331 BC provided Alexander with his most significant territorial acquisition to date, while establishing his credentials as a legitimate pharaoh through religious ceremonies that validated his rule according to Egyptian traditions. The Persian satrap Masasir's decision to surrender without resistance reflected both recognition of Alexander's military superiority and calculation that cooperation might preserve personal position under the new regime. The enthusiastic reception Alexander received from Egyptian priests and people demonstrated their desire for liberation from Persian rule and their willingness to accept Macedonian authority as preferable to foreign domination. The foundation of Alexandria at the mouth of the Nile represented Alexander's first major attempt at creating a new city that would serve both strategic and cultural purposes in his emerging empire. The site's selection, combining access to Mediterranean trade routes with control over Egyptian grain supplies, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of economic geography and commercial requirements. The city's planned layout, designed by the architect Dinocrates according to Hippodamian principles, created a model for future urban foundations throughout Alexander's empire. The pilgrimage to the Oracle of Ammon at Siwa Oasis revealed Alexander's growing interest in divine legitimization and his evolving conception of his own role in world history. The arduous journey across the Libyan desert, accomplished despite navigational difficulties and supply shortages, demonstrated both personal courage and recognition of the political benefits that divine sanction could provide. The oracle's reported recognition of Alexander as the son of Ammon-Zeus created theological foundations for claims to divinity that would become increasingly important during his later reign. The administrative arrangements Alexander established in Egypt demonstrated his developing approach to governing diverse populations through adaptation of local institutions rather than imposition of Macedonian systems. The appointment of Egyptian governors alongside Macedonian military commanders created dual authority structures that preserved traditional administrative practices while ensuring loyalty to the new regime. The respect shown for Egyptian religious traditions, combined with generous patronage of temples and priests, secured popular support while providing legitimacy according to local political concepts. The death of Alexander the Great in Babylon on June 10th, 323 BC, created an immediate succession crisis that would fundamentally reshape the ancient world for the next 3 centuries. The Macedonian king's failure to designate a clear heir, combined with his empire's vast territorial extent and diverse populations, made unified succession virtually impossible. When asked on his deathbed to whom he left his kingdom, Alexander's reported response of "to the strongest" accurately predicted the violent competition that would follow among his generals and companions. The empire that had stretched from the Adriatic Sea to the Indus River would fragment into competing kingdoms whose rulers would spend decades fighting each other, while simultaneously attempting to preserve and adapt the Hellenistic culture that Alexander's conquests had created. The immediate aftermath of Alexander's death revealed the fundamental tensions between Macedonian military traditions and the cosmopolitan imperial system he had attempted to establish. The Macedonian army assembly in Babylon, following ancient custom, possessed the theoretical right to select a new king from among eligible members of the royal house. However, the only direct heirs were Alexander's mentally disabled half-brother, Philip Aridaeus, and his unborn child by the Bactrian princess Roxane. Neither candidate could provide the active military leadership that the empire's survival required, creating a power vacuum that Alexander's generals, known as the Diadochi or successors, would attempt to fill through a combination of constitutional legitimacy and military force. Perdiccas, who had received Alexander's signet ring as chiliarch of the empire, initially attempted to maintain unity by serving as regent for the joint kings Philip III Aridaeus and the infant Alexander IV, born shortly after his father's death. This arrangement preserved constitutional forms while concentrating real power in Perdiccas's hands, but it failed to address the practical impossibility of governing such vast territories through centralized administration. The other Diadochi, each commanding loyal troops and controlling specific regions, possessed both the means and motivation to resist subordination to a colleague they considered an equal, rather than a legitimate superior. The First War of the Diadochi erupted in 322 BC, when Perdiccas's attempt to marry Alexander's sister Cleopatra threatened to legitimize his claims to royal succession through dynastic connection. Antipater in Macedonia, Antigonus in Asia Minor, Ptolemy in Egypt, and Lysimachus in Thrace formed a coalition to prevent Perdiccas from consolidating power over the entire empire. The war's campaigns demonstrated both the military effectiveness of the professional armies Alexander had created and their loyalty to individual commanders rather than abstract imperial unity. When Perdiccas's invasion of Egypt failed and his own officers assassinated him in 321 BC, the dream of maintaining Alexander's empire under unified rule effectively died with him. The settlement reached at Triparadissus in 321 BC, formalized the empire's division among the surviving Diadochi, while maintaining the fiction of royal unity under the nominal kings. Antipater became regent of the empire with authority over Macedonia and Greece, while the other generals received satrapies that they would gradually transform into independent kingdoms. Ptolemy retained Egypt and Cyrenaica. Antigonus controlled most of Asia Minor and northern Syria. Lysimachus held Thrace and northwestern Asia Minor, and Seleucus eventually established himself in Babylonia and the eastern territories. These arrangements, intended as temporary administrative measures, became the foundation for the Hellenistic kingdoms that would dominate the eastern Mediterranean for the next 3 centuries. The transformation of these military commands into hereditary monarchies occurred gradually through a process that combined Macedonian traditions with Persian administrative practices and Greek political theory. The Diadochi initially maintained the pretense of serving as governors under the legitimate kings, but the practical requirements of defending their territories against rivals forced them to act as independent rulers. The assassination of Philip III, Aridaeus in 317 BC, and Alexander IV in 310 BC eliminated the last vestiges of Argead legitimacy, enabling the successors to claim royal titles based on their own achievements rather than constitutional appointment. Ptolemy the Soter's establishment of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt demonstrated the most successful adaptation of Hellenistic monarchy to local conditions and traditions. The Macedonian general's early recognition that Egypt's geographical isolation and economic resources provided unique advantages led him to focus on consolidating control over the Nile Valley rather than pursuing Alexander's Asian territories. The seizure of Alexander's body during its transport to Macedonia and its installation in a magnificent tomb in Alexandria served both propaganda purposes and practical political needs, establishing Ptolemy's credentials as Alexander's legitimate successor while making Alexandria a pilgrimage destination for Greeks throughout the Mediterranean. The Ptolemaic administrative system combined Macedonian military organisation with pharaonic governmental traditions and Greek intellectual culture in ways that created unprecedented prosperity and cultural achievement. The retention of the Egyptian bureaucracy, with its sophisticated systems for managing agricultural production and tax collection, provided the economic foundation for Ptolemaic power while minimizing disruption to local populations. The appointment of Macedonian and Greek officials to key positions ensured loyalty to the dynasty while introducing Hellenistic administrative practices that improved governmental efficiency. The cultural policies implemented by Ptolemy and his successors transformed Alexandria into the intellectual centre of the Hellenistic world through systematic patronage of scholarship and artistic achievement. The famous Library of Alexandria, established around 295 BC, represented the most ambitious attempt in ancient history to collect and preserve human knowledge in a single institution. The library's scholars, supported by royal stipends and provided with access to hundreds of thousands of scrolls, made fundamental contributions to mathematics, astronomy, geography, medicine, and literary studies that would influence intellectual development throughout the ancient world. The museum, functioning as a research institute attached to the library, attracted the greatest scholars of the Hellenistic period through generous patronage and unparalleled research facilities. Euclid's systematic presentation of geometric principles in his Elements, composed during his tenure at the museum, established mathematical foundations that remained standard for over 2 millennia. Eratosthenes' calculation of the Earth's circumference, achieved through ingenious application of geometric principles to astronomical observations, demonstrated the sophisticated scientific methods that Ptolemaic patronage made possible. Apollonius of Perga's work on conic sections advanced mathematical understanding while providing theoretical foundations for later developments in astronomy and physics. The economic foundation of Ptolemaic prosperity rested upon Egypt's unique agricultural advantages and the dynasty's systematic exploitation of the kingdom's natural resources. The Nile's annual flood cycle, carefully managed through an extensive irrigation system maintained by the royal administration, produced grain surpluses that could feed the kingdom's population while generating substantial export revenues. The Ptolemies' monopolization of key industries, including papyrus production, linen manufacturing and beer brewing, created additional revenue streams while ensuring Egyptian dominance in crucial Mediterranean markets. The development of Alexandria as a major commercial centre reflected both the city's advantageous location and the Ptolemies' sophisticated understanding of trade networks and monetary policy. The harbour facilities, including the famous lighthouse that became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, could accommodate the largest merchant vessels while providing secure anchorage for naval fleets. The city's position at the intersection of Mediterranean, Red Sea, and overland trade routes enabled Ptolemaic merchants to profit from commerce between Europe, Africa, and Asia, while maintaining political neutrality in conflicts that disrupted other commercial centres. The Seleucid Empire, established by Seleucus I Nicator in the territories stretching from Syria to Bactria, faced fundamentally different challenges in governing diverse populations across vast distances without natural geographical boundaries. The empire's territorial extent, encompassing modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and parts of Central Asia and Afghanistan, included dozens of different ethnic groups with distinct languages, religions, and political traditions. The Seleucid solution involved creating a flexible administrative system that adapted Macedonian military organization to Persian governmental traditions while establishing Greek cities as centers of Hellenistic culture and political control. The foundation of Antioch around 300 BC represented Seleucus's attempt to create a capital that could rival Alexandria while serving the specific needs of governing the Asian territories. The city's location on the Orontes River, with access to both Mediterranean ports and overland routes to Mesopotamia and Persia, provided the strategic advantages necessary for controlling the empire's western territories. The planned layout, designed according to Hippodamian principles with a regular grid pattern and designated areas for different functions, created an urban environment that could accommodate rapid population growth while maintaining Greek architectural and social standards. The Seleucid policy of founding new cities throughout their territories served both strategic and cultural purposes, creating centres of Greek population while providing administrative bases for governing local populations. Cities like Seleucia on the Tigris, established near the ancient Mesopotamian capital of Babylon, attracted Greek and Macedonian colonists through grants of land and citizenship, while serving as regional capitals for territorial administration. These foundations, numbering in the dozens throughout the empire, created a network of Hellenistic urban centres that facilitated cultural exchange while maintaining loyalty to the Seleucid dynasty. The military challenges facing the Seleucid Empire required constant adaptation of Macedonian tactical systems to diverse enemies and geographical conditions. The Eastern Territories, bordering nomadic peoples of Central Asia, and the expanding Mauryan Empire in India, demanded different strategic approaches than the Western regions, where conflicts with Ptolemaic Egypt and emerging Roman power dominated military planning. The development of heavy cavalry units, including cataphracts equipped with scale armour and long lances, reflected adaptation to Persian and Central Asian military traditions, while maintaining the tactical coordination that characterized Hellenistic warfare. The religious policies implemented throughout the Seleucid territories demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the relationship between political authority and cultural identity in governing diverse populations. The dynasty's support for local religious traditions, combined with the introduction of ruler cult practices that identified kings with traditional deities, created syncretic belief systems that maintained popular loyalty while establishing divine legitimacy for Seleucid rule. The construction of Greek temples alongside traditional religious structures in cities like Babylon and Ecbatana symbolized the cultural synthesis that characterized Hellenistic civilization at its most successful. The Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia faced different challenges in maintaining control over the Greek homeland, while defending against barbarian invasions and Roman expansion. Antigonus II Gonatas, who finally established stable Antigonid rule around 276 BC after decades of warfare and political instability, inherited a kingdom that had been devastated by constant fighting and Celtic invasions. The restoration of Macedonian power required not only military success, but also the reconstruction of economic and political institutions that could support effective governance over territories that remained culturally Greek while accepting Macedonian hegemony. The Antigonid approach to governing Greece involved a careful balance between direct control and the preservation of polis autonomy that characterized traditional Greek political culture. The maintenance of Macedonian garrisons in key strategic locations, including the Acrocorinth fortress that controlled the Isthmus of Corinth, ensured military dominance while allowing individual cities to maintain their traditional governmental institutions. This system, less intrusive than Ptolemaic or Seleucid administrative methods, reflected both practical limitations on Macedonian resources and sophisticated understanding of Greek political sensibilities. The cultural developments that occurred within these Hellenistic kingdoms represented a fundamental transformation of Greek civilization through contact with Eastern traditions and the requirements of governing diverse populations over vast territories. The court culture that emerged in Alexandria, Antioch, and Pella combined Macedonian military traditions with Persian ceremonial practices and Greek intellectual achievements in ways that created new forms of artistic expression and political organization. The patronage systems that supported poets, scholars, and artists enabled cultural production on scales that individual poleis could never have achieved, while encouraging innovation through competition between different royal courts. The transformation of Greek artistic traditions reflected both the cosmopolitan environment of Hellenistic cities and the preferences of royal patrons who sought to demonstrate their cultural sophistication and political legitimacy. The development of new sculptural styles, exemplified by works like the Laocoon group and the Nike of Samothrace, emphasized emotional expression and dramatic movement rather than the idealized restraint that had characterized classical Greek art. These innovations, supported by royal commissions and the wealth generated by expanded trade networks, created artistic traditions that would influence Mediterranean culture for centuries. The philosophical developments that occurred during the Hellenistic period reflected the changed political and social conditions that Greek intellectuals faced in a world dominated by monarchical power rather than polis citizenship. The Stoic school, founded by Zeno of Citium around 300 BC, developed ethical systems that emphasized individual virtue and cosmic citizenship rather than participation in specific political communities. This philosophical approach, which attracted adherents throughout the Hellenistic kingdoms and later the Roman Empire, provided intellectual frameworks for understanding personal responsibility and moral behavior in political systems that offered limited opportunities for citizen participation. The Epicurean school, established by Epicurus in Athens around the same time, offered alternative approaches to achieving happiness and fulfillment through withdrawal from political involvement and focus on personal relationships and intellectual pleasure. The school's emphasis on friendship, scientific understanding, and the pursuit of ataraxia provided psychological strategies for coping with the uncertainties and limited political agency that characterized life under monarchical rule. The popularity of both Stoic and Epicurean philosophies throughout the Hellenistic world demonstrated the extent to which traditional polis-based approaches to ethics and politics had become inadequate for changed circumstances. The scientific achievements that occurred during the Hellenistic period reflected both the patronage available from wealthy monarchs and the cultural exchange that resulted from expanded geographical knowledge and commercial contacts. The work of Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, demonstrated the sophisticated astronomical observations and mathematical calculations that Hellenistic scholars could undertake with royal support and access to accumulated knowledge from different traditions. Archimedes of Syracuse, though working outside the major Hellenistic kingdoms, exemplified the practical applications of mathematical and physical principles that characterized Hellenistic science. The medical advances achieved by scholars like Herophilus and Erasistratus in Alexandria reflected both the institutional support provided by the Ptolemies and the cultural environment that encouraged systematic investigation of natural phenomena. The practice of human dissection, permitted in Alexandria but forbidden in most Greek cities due to religious restrictions, enabled these physicians to make fundamental discoveries about anatomy and physiology that advanced medical understanding throughout the ancient world. The establishment of medical schools and the systematic collection of medical knowledge represented institutional innovations that would influence the development of scientific medicine for centuries. The expansion of geographical knowledge that resulted from Hellenistic exploration and commercial expansion created new understanding of the world's extent and diversity while providing practical information for navigation and trade. The voyages sponsored by Ptolemaic rulers in the Red Sea and Indian Ocean opened new trade routes that brought exotic goods and cultural influences to Mediterranean markets. The accounts of these expeditions, preserved in works like the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, provided detailed information about African and Asian societies that expanded Greek understanding of human diversity and cultural variation. The gradual Roman intervention in Greek affairs during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC occurred initially through defensive alliances and limited territorial objectives, but eventually evolved into systematic conquest that eliminated Hellenistic independence. The Pyrrhic War of 275 BC, fought when Pyrrhus of Epirus invaded southern Italy to assist Greek cities against Roman expansion, demonstrated both the continuing military effectiveness of Hellenistic armies and their ultimate inability to achieve decisive victory against Roman persistence and resources. Pyrrhus's tactical victories at Heraclea and Asculum, achieved at such enormous cost that they gave rise to the term Pyrrhic victory, reveal the strategic limitations of Hellenistic military systems when facing enemies who could sustain repeated defeats without abandoning their objectives. The First Macedonian War marked the beginning of systematic Roman involvement in Greek politics through alliance with the Aetolian League against Philip V of Macedon. The conflict's origins lay in Philip's alliance with Hannibal during the Second Punic War, which threatened Roman interests in the Adriatic while providing Carthaginian forces with potential reinforcement from experienced Macedonian troops. The Roman decision to open a second front in Greece, despite their desperate situation in Italy, demonstrated both strategic sophistication and recognition that Hellenistic kingdoms posed long-term threats to Roman security that required preemptive action. The Second Macedonian War resulted in the decisive defeat of Philip V at Cynocephaly, where Roman tactical flexibility and superior logistics overcame traditional Macedonian phalanx formations in terrain that favoured Roman manipular tactics. The battle demonstrated the evolution of military technology and organisation that had occurred since Alexander's conquests, as Roman legions proved capable of defeating the tactical systems that had dominated Mediterranean warfare for over a century. The subsequent settlement, which proclaimed the freedom of Greek cities while establishing Roman hegemony over their foreign relations, created the political framework that would govern Roman-Greek relations until the final conquest of the Hellenistic kingdoms. The Syrian war against Antiochus III extended Roman power into Asia Minor while eliminating Seleucid influence in European affairs. The conflict began when Antiochus, encouraged by Hannibal, who had taken refuge at his court, attempted to establish Seleucid control over the Greek cities of Asia Minor and Thrace. The Roman victories at Thermopylae and Magnesia demonstrated both the tactical superiority of Roman military organisation and the strategic advantages provided by Greek allies, who supported Roman intervention against Hellenistic monarchies. The Treaty of Apamea, which excluded Seleucid forces from territories west of the Taurus Mountains, while imposing massive indemnity payments, effectively ended Seleucid power in the western Mediterranean. The Third Macedonian War culminated in the Battle of Pydna, where Lucius Aemilius Paulus achieved perhaps the most complete victory in Roman military history against Perseus, the last Antigonid king of Macedonia. The tactical coordination between Roman legions and allied cavalry, combined with superior logistics and strategic planning, overwhelmed Macedonian forces that had been reorganized according to traditional phalanx principles. The subsequent division of Macedonia into 4 separate republics, designed to prevent future unified resistance while maintaining the fiction of Greek freedom, demonstrated Roman sophistication in governing conquered territories through indirect control methods. The final destruction of the Achaean League in 146 BC, accomplished through Lucius Mummius's systematic devastation of Corinth, marked the end of meaningful Greek independence and the beginning of direct Roman provincial administration. The conflict arose from Achaean attempts to assert authority over Sparta, which appealed to Rome for protection against League interference in its internal affairs. The Roman decision to make an example of Corinth through complete destruction and the enslavement of its population served both practical and symbolic purposes, eliminating a major commercial rival while demonstrating the consequences of resistance to Roman authority. The transformation of Greece into the Roman province of Achaia completed the process of conquest that had begun with defensive alliances and evolved into systematic territorial annexation. The transformation of Greece into the Roman province of Achaia completed the process of conquest that had begun with defensive alliances and evolved into systematic territorial annexation. The sack of Corinth in 146 BC by Lucius Mummius represented more than military victory. It marked the definitive end of Greek political independence and the beginning of a new era in which Greek culture would survive and flourish under Roman patronage while Greek political institutions withered under imperial administration. The systematic destruction of Corinth's buildings, the slaughter of its male population, and the enslavement of women and children served as a brutal demonstration to any remaining Greek communities that resistance to Roman authority would result in complete annihilation. The establishment of the province of Achaia encompassed most of mainland Greece south of Macedonia, creating an administrative unit that brought Greek cities under direct Roman governance for the first time. The provincial system implemented by Rome represented a fundamental departure from the loose hegemonic arrangements that had characterized earlier periods of foreign domination. Unlike the Persian Empire, which had generally allowed Greek cities to maintain their traditional institutions under Persian oversight, or the Hellenistic kingdoms, which had preserved at least the fiction of polis autonomy, Roman provincial administration imposed direct control through appointed governors who answered to the Senate in Rome rather than local assemblies or traditional magistrates. The Roman governor of Achaia, typically a former praetor serving a 1-year term, possessed absolute authority over judicial, military and administrative matters throughout the province. This concentration of power in a single individual, backed by Roman military force and legal precedent, eliminated the complex negotiations and diplomatic relationships that had characterized interstate relations during the classical and Hellenistic periods. Greek cities retained some local administrative functions, particularly in matters of municipal governance and religious observances, but their decisions remained subject to Roman oversight and could be overturned by provincial authorities whenever they conflicted with imperial interests. The economic transformation that accompanied Roman conquest proved as significant as the political changes in reshaping Greek society and culture. The tribute system imposed on Greek cities, while less systematically extractive than the Athenian Empire had been, nevertheless redirected substantial resources from local communities to Roman coffers. The requirement that tribute be paid in Roman silver currency forced Greek cities to engage with Roman monetary systems while creating demand for Roman coins that facilitated commercial integration throughout the Mediterranean. The standardization of weights, measures and legal procedures according to Roman models eliminated many of the local variations that had characterized Greek economic life during the Polis period. Roman exploitation of Greek artistic and intellectual resources took forms that were both more subtle and more comprehensive than simple tribute collection. The systematic removal of Greek artworks to decorate Roman public buildings and private villas represented cultural appropriation on an unprecedented scale, as Roman generals and administrators competed to demonstrate their sophistication through the display of Greek sculptures, paintings and decorative objects. The transportation of entire libraries from Greek cities to Rome, combined with the recruitment of Greek scholars and teachers for Roman households, created a brain drain that weakened Greek intellectual institutions while enriching Roman cultural life. Yet this cultural transfer also created opportunities for Greek intellectual traditions to survive and evolve under Roman patronage in ways that might not have been possible under continued political independence. The Roman appreciation for Greek learning, while often superficial and status-driven, nevertheless provided employment and support for Greek philosophers, rhetoricians, historians, and scientists who might otherwise have lacked the resources necessary for scholarly work. The establishment of Greek schools in Rome and other Roman cities created new centres of Hellenistic culture that preserved and transmitted Greek intellectual achievements to broader audiences than the traditional polis system had ever reached. The second sophistic movement that emerged during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD represented perhaps the most significant example of Greek cultural vitality under Roman rule. This intellectual revival, centred around rhetorical education and performance, created new forms of Greek literature and oratory that combined classical traditions with contemporary concerns. Sophists like Dio Chrysostom, Aelius Aristides and Lucian of Samosata achieved fame throughout the Roman Empire through their eloquent presentations of Greek cultural values and their sophisticated critiques of contemporary society and politics. The philosophical schools that had flourished in Athens during the Hellenistic period continued their activities under Roman rule, though with significant modifications in their approaches and objectives. The Academy, the Lyceum and the Garden of Epicurus maintained their institutional continuity while adapting their teachings to appeal to Roman students and patrons. The Stoic school proved particularly successful in this adaptation, as its emphasis on duty, rational governance and cosmic citizenship resonated with Roman imperial ideology, while providing ethical frameworks that could guide behaviour in complex administrative and military situations. The Neoplatonic movement that developed during the later Roman period represented a synthesis of Greek philosophical traditions with religious and mystical elements that reflected the changing spiritual climate of the imperial world. Philosophers like Plotinus and Proclus created sophisticated metaphysical systems that combined Platonic idealism with religious practices and theological speculation, producing intellectual traditions that would influence both Christian and Islamic thought for centuries. The survival and development of these philosophical schools demonstrated the continuing vitality of Greek intellectual culture, even under conditions of political subjugation. The Mithridatic Wars that erupted during the 1st century BC provided Greek cities with their last significant opportunity to challenge Roman domination through alliance with a foreign power capable of matching Roman military resources. Mithridates VI of Pontus, who had created a powerful kingdom in Asia Minor through conquest and diplomacy, represented himself as a liberator of Greek cities from Roman oppression, while offering concrete benefits, including the cancellation of debts and the restoration of traditional privileges. His initial successes, including the massacre of Roman citizens throughout Asia Minor in 88 BC, demonstrated both the extent of anti-Roman sentiment among Greek populations and the military capabilities that a determined enemy could deploy against Roman provincial forces. The response of Greek cities to Mithridatic invasion revealed the complex calculations that local communities faced when choosing between Roman security and the uncertain promises of liberation. Cities like Athens, which had suffered economic decline under Roman rule, welcomed Mithridatic forces and participated enthusiastically in anti-Roman activities. The Athenian decision to massacre Roman residents and allies demonstrated the intensity of resentment that had accumulated during decades of provincial exploitation. However, other cities, particularly those that had prospered under Roman administration or feared the consequences of unsuccessful rebellion, remained loyal to Rome and provided crucial support for Roman military operations. The Siege of Athens by Sulla in 86 BC represented one of the most brutal episodes in the long history of Roman-Greek conflict, as the Roman general employed systematic starvation and terror tactics to force the city's surrender. The destruction of the Piraeus and the slaughter of Athenian civilians who had supported Mithridates served both military and political purposes, eliminating resistance while demonstrating to other Greek cities the consequences of choosing the wrong side in conflicts between great powers. Sulla's reported comment that he was sparing Athens for the sake of its dead ancestors rather than its living citizens reflected both Roman appreciation for Greek cultural achievements and contempt for contemporary Greek political choices. The final defeat of Mithridates and his Greek allies eliminated the last realistic possibility of successful resistance to Roman rule, while demonstrating the military superiority that Rome had achieved through professional armies and systematic logistics. The battles of Chaeronea and Orchomenus, where Sulla's legions destroyed much larger Pontic and Greek forces, proved that traditional Greek military tactics were no match for Roman organizational advantages and tactical flexibility. The subsequent peace settlements, which imposed massive indemnities on cities that had supported Mithridates while rewarding those that had remained loyal, created economic and political incentives that discouraged future resistance movements. The civil wars that consumed the Roman Republic during the 1st century BC brought additional devastation to Greek territories as competing Roman commanders fought for control of the Mediterranean world. The conflict between Pompey and Caesar, followed by the wars between the triumvirs and the conspirators who assassinated Caesar, transformed Greek cities into battlefields and sources of supply for Roman armies that showed little concern for local welfare or cultural preservation. The Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, fought in Thessaly between Caesar and Pompey, demonstrated how completely Greek territories had become subordinated to Roman political conflicts that Greek communities could neither influence nor avoid. The proscriptions and confiscations that accompanied these civil wars eliminated much of the wealth that had sustained Greek cultural institutions, while creating new opportunities for collaboration with Roman authorities. Greek intellectuals and artists who could provide useful services to Roman commanders found employment and patronage, while those who lacked such connections faced economic hardship or political persecution. The transformation of Greek cities into Roman military bases and supply depots disrupted traditional economic activities, while creating new forms of dependence on Roman military spending and administrative employment. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC, fought in the waters off the western coast of Greece, marked the final chapter of Hellenistic independence, as Octavian's victory over Mark Antony and Cleopatra VII eliminated the last major challenge to Roman imperial unity. The naval engagement itself, while tactically indecisive, proved strategically decisive when Cleopatra's withdrawal from the battle prompted Antony's flight and the collapse of their combined forces. The psychological impact of this defeat extended far beyond its immediate military consequences, as it demonstrated the impossibility of successfully challenging Roman power, even with the combined resources of the Eastern Mediterranean. Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt, represented more than simply another Hellenistic monarch. She embodied the final attempt to maintain Greek political independence through adaptation to Roman power structures. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony reflected sophisticated understanding of Roman politics and genuine attempts to preserve Egyptian autonomy through personal influence over Roman leaders. The cultural synthesis she promoted, combining Egyptian religious traditions with Greek intellectual achievements and Roman political methods, demonstrated the greater potential of Hellenistic civilization even under conditions of extreme political pressure. The suicide of Cleopatra following Octavian's capture of Alexandria eliminated the last major Hellenistic kingdom while providing a dramatic conclusion to the political system that Alexander's conquests had created 3 centuries earlier. Her death marked not only the end of Ptolemaic rule in Egypt, but also the final collapse of the balance of power system that had characterized Hellenistic interstate relations. The Roman annexation of Egypt as a personal possession of the emperor, rather than a regular province governed through senatorial appointment, demonstrated the strategic importance that Roman leaders attached to controlling the kingdom's enormous wealth and grain production. The cultural legacy of ancient Greece survived its political extinction through the very Roman conquest that had destroyed Greek independence. The Roman appreciation for Greek intellectual achievements, artistic traditions, and educational methods ensured that Greek culture would continue to influence Mediterranean civilization long after Greek political institutions had disappeared. The establishment of Greek schools throughout the Roman Empire, the translation of Greek texts into Latin, and the adoption of Greek architectural and artistic styles by Roman patrons created new forms of cultural transmission that preserved essential elements of Greek civilization while adapting them to Roman imperial contexts. The transformation of Greek religious practices under Roman rule demonstrated both continuity and change in the spiritual life of Greek communities. Traditional Greek deities continued to receive worship and patronage, often with Roman names and attributes that reflected the syncretic tendencies of imperial religion. The mystery religions that had developed during the Hellenistic period, including the cults of Dionysus, Demeter, and various Eastern deities, found new audiences throughout the Roman Empire while maintaining their Greek origins and ceremonial practices. The eventual triumph of Christianity, which had emerged from the intersection of Greek philosophical traditions with Jewish religious concepts, represented the ultimate transformation of Greek spiritual culture under Roman imperial conditions. The educational system that developed throughout the Roman Empire preserved and transmitted Greek intellectual traditions while adapting them to serve Roman administrative and cultural needs. The study of Greek literature, philosophy, and rhetoric became essential components of elite Roman education, ensuring that Greek cultural achievements would remain accessible to educated audiences for centuries. The preservation of Greek texts through copying and translation projects, supported by both private collectors and imperial patronage, created the manuscript traditions that would eventually enable the recovery of Greek learning during the Byzantine and Renaissance periods. Thus ended the remarkable journey of ancient Greek civilization, from its humble beginnings in the Bronze Age Aegean, through the classical flowering of the polis system, to the cosmopolitan achievements of the Hellenistic kingdoms. The Roman conquest of 146 BC marked not the death of Greek culture, but its transformation into new forms that would continue to influence Western civilization for millennia to come. The political independence that had defined Greek identity since the Dark Ages was lost forever, but the intellectual, artistic, and cultural achievements that had made Greek civilization distinctive survived to enrich the broader Mediterranean world under Roman imperial unity. In losing their political freedom, the Greeks had gained a form of cultural immortality that would outlast all the empires that conquered them.